Close your eyes if they are not closed already, and let me show you the picture you are almost certainly carrying, the one that arrives, whole and terrible and complete, the instant anyone says the words "the Library of Alexandria." It comes to nearly all of us the same way, because we were all handed the same painting, and it is a magnificent painting, and it goes like this. It is night, one particular night, a single night out of all the nights of the ancient world, and it is the night that everything ends. There is a great hall, longer than a hall has any right to be, its ceiling lost in shadow above rows upon rows of dark wooden shelving, and in every pigeonhole of every shelf there lies a rolled scroll of pale papyrus. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, each one a mind, each one a voice, each one the only copy in the world of something a human being once thought hard enough to write down. And then, at one end of that hall, small at first, there is a light that should not be there. A flame. Perhaps a torch dropped in carelessness by a frightened man. Perhaps a torch flung in malice by a cruel one. The painting is never quite sure, and it does not much care, because either way the flame finds the first dry roll of papyrus, and papyrus, you understand, is nothing but dried reed and air. It is practically made to burn, and so the fire climbs. It climbs the way we have all seen it climb in our imaginations, from shelf to shelf and row to row, faster than men can run. And the scholars come stumbling out of their sleeping cells into the corridors, and they cannot get near it, and the great bronze-fitted doors are too far, and the water is too little and too late, and so they can only stand in the warm orange dark and watch the accumulated learning of 1,000 years turn, in the space of a few hours, into a rising column of sparks. 500,000 scrolls, that is the number the painting likes to whisper, 500,000, and it whispers too the roll call of what went up in them that night, the lost plays of the great tragedians, 90 of them by one hand alone, and only 7 come down to us, the true measurements of the heavens, the maps of coasts no European would sail again for 1,500 years. The histories of Babylon and Egypt written by priests who could still read the old stones, the cure perhaps, for something we are still dying of now. All of it, the painting says, all of it lost in one night, in one fire, by one torch, in one place, and the world went dark, and stayed dark, and if only that one night had gone differently, we would be 1,000 years ahead of where we stand. That is the picture. And I want you to notice, before we do anything else with it, how good it is, how clean, how satisfying, how it fits in the hand like a stone-worn smooth. It has everything a story needs. It has one place, so you know where to look. It has one night, so you know when to grieve. It has one villain, or at least one careless hand, so you know whom to blame. And it has one loss so total and so sudden that you can feel the size of it in your chest without having to do any of the slow arithmetic of history. It is, in short, a perfect story. And I am here tonight, gently, and with no unkindness at all toward anyone who ever told it to you, or to me, to tell you that it is almost certainly not what happened. There was no one night. There was no single fire that did it. There was no single villain, no one torch, no one door that, had it only held, would have saved the ancient world. The truth is slower than that, and stranger, and in its own quiet way sadder. And, I promise you this, and we will earn the promise together over the hours ahead, in the end far more consoling than the fire ever was. Good evening, and welcome back. Come in, and let me get you settled, because we are going to be a long while together tonight, you and I, and there is no hurry in any part of it. Tonight I want to tell you the true story of how the greatest library the world had ever known actually vanished from the earth, not the story of the night it burned, because it did not burn in a night, but the far longer and far gentler and far more human story of how a thing that enormous can slip away so slowly that no one alive at any single moment ever quite sees it go. And before we take a single step down that road, I want to make you a promise the same promise I always make, and I would like you to hold me to it all the way to the end. Everything I tell you tonight, I will tell you honestly. Where we have good evidence, I will give it to you plainly, and tell you how good it is. And where the evidence runs thin, where the only writers who mention a thing lived centuries after it, where two ancient authors flatly contradict each other, where the honest answer to a question is that nobody knows and nobody can know, I will not paper over that gap with a confident voice and a made-up number. I will stop. I will tell you, in so many words, here is where the receipts run out, and we will stand together at that edge and look out into the dark of what is unknown, which is, I have come to believe, one of the most restful things two people can do, because so much of what keeps us awake is the pretending, the straining to be certain, and there is a deep and particular peace in being allowed, for once simply to say, we do not know, and that is all right, and we can rest anyway. So that is the contract for tonight, and it has 2 clauses, and I will repeat them so you can lean on them whenever you like. First, we will pick the great myth up honestly, in both hands, and turn it over, and look underneath, and correct it only with real receipts, with what the ancient witnesses actually wrote, and when they wrote it, and whether they were even there. And second, wherever those receipts give out, we will say so out loud, and never once pretend to know a thing we do not know. Receipts, and honesty about where the receipts end. That is the whole of it. And you may lean your full weight on that contract all night long, the way you would lean on a wall you have already tested with your hand. Now let me help you get comfortable, because the story is not going anywhere and neither are we, and there is genuinely nothing you need to do for the next while, except be here and breathe. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has pushed them, down, and then a little further than that, because there is nearly always a little further, some small held tension in the tops of the shoulders that has been waiting all day for permission to let go, and here is the permission. Let whatever is beneath you take your weight completely, the bed, the chair, the pillow, whatever is holding you, let it hold you, fully, so that not one muscle is still doing the work of keeping you up. Because that job is finished for today, and you may hand it over now. Let the small hinge of the jaw come unclenched. Let the space between your eyebrows go soft and wide. And let your breath lengthen and slow all on its own, without you standing over it and managing it. Just let it find its own long, easy rhythm, in and out, like water moving against a quiet quay. And if, somewhere in the middle of all this, before we have even reached the founding of the city, before the first Ptolemy has dreamed his enormous dream, before a single ship is searched in the harbour for books, if somewhere in there you feel yourself beginning to slip down under the surface of the words, then good. That is not you failing to listen. That is the whole design of the thing. This story has waited more than 2,000 years to be told properly. It has outwaited the fall of Rome and the rise and fall of empires that had not been imagined when the last scroll was shelved. It knows, better than almost anything else I could describe to you, how to be patient, and it will keep every part of itself warm and waiting for you until the next time you come to it. You truly cannot miss anything tonight. There is no test in the morning. And before we set out, let me ask you what I always ask, because I like to know who is here. Where are you listening from tonight? A city, with the sound of traffic gone soft and far below a high window, a house out in the country with the whole dark land breathing around it, a room over a quiet street where the last light has just gone out across the way, somewhere the rain is coming steadily down, or somewhere the summer air is standing still and warm and will not move until dawn. Wherever it is, and whoever you are, and however heavy or however strange this particular day has been, you are welcome here, and this hour belongs to you. And I am glad, honestly glad, that you came back. So, let us begin the way we always must, which is not with the truth but with the myth. because you cannot set a thing down gently until you have first picked it up honestly, and the myth of the one great fire is one that almost every single one of us is carrying, tucked away somewhere near the words Alexandria and lost and forever, and it deserves to be laid out in full, and honoured for the good story that it is, before we ever turn it over. But to understand why the loss of this library came to feel like the loss of the whole ancient world, why it is this library, out of all the libraries that ever were, whose burning we still mourn as though it happened to us personally, you have to understand first what the thing actually was, and where it stood, and how bright it once burned in a wholly different and better sense than fire. So let me sketch it for you now, only lightly, only enough to make the coming loss matter, because we will go back and build it properly, brick by brick and scroll by scroll, before this night is out. Picture then a city on the edge of Egypt, on a low strip of pale land where the great green delta of the Nile finally lets go of the sea. A young city as ancient cities go, laid out new, all at once, on a straight grid. The way a thing is laid out when a single ambitious mind has decided it into being, rather than letting it grow crooked over centuries the way most cities grow. A city of white and honey-coloured limestone, of long straight avenues wide enough to take your breath, of colonnades running cool and shadowed beside the bright streets, rising gently up from the water. And the water, the harbour, was the whole heart of it, a wide, calm sweep of the Mediterranean dark teal in the evening, held in the arms of the shore, crowded with wooden ships riding at anchor with their single masts and their sails furled, their hulls creaking softly against one another all night long. Every one of those ships had come from somewhere, from Athens, from Rhodes, from Syracuse, from the mouths of rivers whose names are half forgotten now, and every one of them, as we shall see, was a thing to be searched, not for gold, but for books. And standing over that harbour, out on the tip of an island joined to the shore by a long causeway, there rose the thing you would have seen first, from miles out at sea, long before the city itself lifted over the horizon. A tower. Not a temple, not a palace, a tower built for one purpose: to be seen, an immense three-tiered lighthouse of pale weathered stone. A broad square base and a narrower eight-sided middle and a slim round top, taller than anything else on that whole coast, taller than almost anything human beings had yet built anywhere, and at its very summit, night after night after night, a single fire burned in a great brazier, throwing warm gold light out across the dark water so that sailors far out in the black could find their way home, to the one bright point on the edge of the world. Hold that image, because I am going to give it back to you at the very end of tonight, and it will mean something more by then. The lighthouse, patient, burning its one steady fire over the calm dark harbour, keeping the watch. That was the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the old world, and it stood, you will notice, for fire that saves rather than fire that destroys, a fire tended on purpose, every night, by ordinary people, for centuries, because it was loved and needed and kept. Remember that. And somewhere in behind that harbour, in the royal quarter of the city, among the palaces, stood the reason we are here tonight, though it did not look, from the street, like the reason the whole world would one day grieve. It was not at first a building you would have crossed an ocean to see, the way you would cross an ocean to see the tower. It was a set of halls, long colonnaded halls of marble, with tall arched openings that looked out toward the sea, and inside them the light came down soft and warm from oil lamps and pooled on stone floors. And along the walls stood rows upon rows of wooden shelving fitted with pigeonholes, and in every pigeonhole lay a scroll. A rolled cylinder of papyrus the colour of old honey and old bone, a little frayed at its edges, wound sometimes on a wooden rod, with a small tag hanging from it, so a person could find the one they wanted among the thousands. That was the library. Or rather, that was the visible body of a thing whose real substance was invisible, not the shelves, not the scrolls even, but the astonishing idea that had gathered them. The idea, and we will come to it properly, that one could and should collect, under a single roof, a copy of every book that existed anywhere in the entire world. Every book. Not a fine selection. Not the best of them. All of them. The great and the small, the noble poetry and the dull tax records, the medicine and the mathematics and the star charts, and the cookbooks and the plays and the prophecies and the grammar lessons and the ship's logs. The whole written mind of humanity brought to one place and copied and kept and made findable, so that a scholar in one quiet room could reach up and take down the accumulated thought of every people who had ever set a reed to a page. There had never been anything like it before. And attached to those halls, the part that made the library more than a warehouse, there was the Museon, the House of the Muses, from which our word museum comes. Though it was nothing like a museum, it was something closer to the first great university and research institute the world ever paid for out of a public purse. A place where scholars lived and were fed and were given rooms and a salary and, most precious of all, time. Time to do nothing but think and read and argue and measure and write. And what they did there, in that soft lamplight, with all the books of the world within arm's reach, is the reason the loss still aches. It was here, in this place, that a man worked out the true size of the round earth to within a whisker of the real figure, using nothing but shadows and a well and a very great deal of careful thought. It was here that the stars were first patiently mapped and named. It was here that the tangled, many-voiced text of Homer was combed and edited into something close to the poem we still read. It was here that the very art of the library itself was invented. The catalogue, the index, the whole quiet science of knowing what you have and where it is, without which knowledge is only a heap. This was not a tomb full of dead scrolls. It was the most alive place in the ancient world, humming late into the night with lamplight and argument and the dry whisper of papyrus being unrolled. A place where the sum of what human beings knew was not only stored, but actually grew, year upon year, generation upon generation, brighter and brighter. And that living brightness, that gathered light of 1,000 years of human thought, is the thing we picture going up in flames in a single night. That is why the myth of the one fire has such a terrible grip on us. Because if you believe the light was that bright, and you believe it went out all at once, then you cannot help but feel the darkness that rushed in to fill the space. And you cannot help but ask the unbearable question of how far ahead we might all be now, tonight, if only one door had held. But here is what I am going to spend the rest of these hours showing you, gently, one honest receipt at a time. That is not how the light went out. A flame going out in a single breath is one kind of grief, but that is not the grief that happened here. What happened here was closer to something we all know in our own smaller lives. The slow way a thing we love goes dim, not because anyone strikes it down, but because, little by little, over a very long time, it stops being tended. It was not a night. It was something on the order of 600 years, 6 long, quiet, mostly unwitnessed centuries, across which the greatest library in the world did not so much burn as fade. A little fire here, yes, we will look hard at the fire and we will be honest about it. But far more than fire, a slow ebbing of the money that had paid for everything, a scattering of the scholars who had been its living memory, a drifting of fashion away from the old learning, a quiet forgetting, and beneath all of that, patient as rot. The plain physical truth that papyrus does not last, that in the damp salt air of a seacoast every single scroll had to be copied out again by hand, every few generations, or it would simply crumble back into the dust it came from, so that a library is never a finished thing you can put on a shelf and leave, but a living act of constant recopying that must be renewed forever, or it dies of its own accord, silently, in the dark, with no flames at all to mark the loss. That is the shape of the journey we are going to take tonight, not a flash across one night, but a long, slow fade across 6 centuries. We will go back to the very beginning and watch the great dream take hold, and the library rise to a height of brightness that has never quite been matched since. We will come to the one famous fire, a Roman general, a burning fleet, a harbour full of smoke in the year 48 before our era, and we will read the actual witnesses to it, and discover that they cannot agree with one another, and that several of them, who ought to have shouted, say nothing at all. We will walk through the long, quiet middle centuries that the myth always skips precisely because there is no fire in them to point at. We will stand on a certain hilltop in the year 391, and on a certain street in the year 415, and outside a certain conquered city in the year 642, and at each of those famous scenes of destruction we will do the same patient thing, build the dramatic version fairly, and then read the receipts, and see what is really there. And at the end, near the very end, we will finally answer the question the whole night is built around. How did the greatest library the world had ever known actually vanish? And I will tell you now that the answer, when it comes, will not frighten you, and may even comfort you, and that we will end not in fire at all, but out on that calm dark harbour, under the turning stars, with the lighthouse still burning its one patient flame over the water. But all of that is still ahead of us, and none of it is going anywhere, and there is no need to reach for any of it yet. For now, let it be enough to have set the great painting down, the one night, the one fire, the one villain, the 500,000 scrolls, set it down gently on the floor between us, where we can both still see it, and where we will pick it up again, piece by piece, when the time comes. And let it be enough to have stood, for a moment, in the soft lamplight of those long marble halls, in the living brightness of the thing before any of the dimming began, and to have looked out through the tall arched openings at the harbour and the ships and the far bright tower on its island. Because to understand how a thing was lost, you have first to love it a little, and to love it you have first to see it whole and burning in the good way, the lamplit way, at the very top of its life. So that is where we are going to go first, in the chapter to come, all the way back to the beginning, to a stretch of empty Egyptian coast, where there was as yet no city at all, no harbour, no tower, no halls, no scrolls, only a conqueror's idea drawn in the sand, and a dream so large that when I tell it to you, you may not quite believe that anyone ever seriously meant to carry it out. Let your breath go long and slow. Let the harbour water move, dark and calm, behind your closed eyes, and come with me, unhurried, back to the founding. So let us do the fair thing and the gentle thing, and go all the way back to the very beginning, before there was any fire to fear, before there was anything at all on that stretch of coast worth the losing, and build the thing up slowly with our own hands in the quiet of the night, stone by stone and scroll by scroll, so that when the long slow ending comes for it later, as it must, you will feel the weight of what is fading and not merely the name of it, because you cannot properly mourn a thing you never saw standing, and I want you to see it standing first, lamplit and full and humming with quiet work, before we let a single year of the long coming down begin. Picture, then, a low flat shore on the northern edge of Egypt, where the land runs out into the Mediterranean in pale sand and paler stone, a place that for a very long time held almost nothing, a small fishing settlement, a scatter of huts, a village whose name the Egyptians spoke as Rakotes, and offshore of it a long island called Pharos with the open sea beyond, and between the island and the shore a natural shelter of calm water where ships might lie, safe out of the weather. It is not, when you first look at it, the sort of place where you would expect the greatest storehouse of human knowledge that the ancient world would ever raise to come and stand. It is a marshy, salt-smelling, workaday edge of the world. But a young conqueror came down that coast a little over 300 years before the birth of Christ, a Macedonian king still in his 20s who had already walked farther and one more than seems quite possible for one short life. And he looked at that sheltered water between the island and the shore, and something in him saw a city there, and he ordered one founded on the spot and gave it his own name, and the name was Alexandria, and then, as young conquerors will, he moved on eastward into the enormous unfinished business of his ambitions, and never in his life saw the city he had named grow up, because he died far away and young, and the vast dominion he had gathered was carved apart among his generals like a great estate divided among quarrelling heirs. And one of those generals, a shrewd and patient man, took Egypt for his portion, and made himself in time its king, and founded a line of kings after him, a whole dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs who would rule that ancient land from the new city on the sea for very nearly 300 years, and it is this man and his son's son, these first careful, calculating, book-loving kings, who are the true founders of the thing we have come here to remember, and not the young conqueror whose name the city wore. We tend, when we tell it quickly, to hang the whole glory of the library on the great romantic name of the conqueror, and it makes a tidier story that way, but the truth is gentler and more to my liking, because the men who actually built it were not out on the edge of the world with an army. They were at home, at a desk, doing the unglamorous. Patient, deeply civilized work of gathering, and paying for it year after year out of the royal treasury, and that is a quieter kind of greatness, and a rarer one, and I think a better one. And here is the dream they had, and I want you to sit with how strange and how large it is, because familiarity has worn it smooth, and we say it now without feeling it, they decided, these kings. That they would gather into one place, under one roof, in one city, a copy of every book that existed anywhere in the entire world. Not the best books, not the useful books or the holy books, or the books that flattered them. Every book. Every book that any people anywhere had ever written down, in any tongue, on any subject, gathered and copied and shelved and kept, so that the whole of what the human mind had so far managed to think and record might rest together in a single hall and be read across from one shelf to the next by a single reader in a single lifetime. It had, so far as we can tell, never been tried before, not on anything like that scale, not as a deliberate and funded and unending policy of the state, and it is, when you hold it up to the light, one of the most hopeful ideas any human being has ever had. This notion that knowledge is one single thing, that it belongs together, that the mathematics of one people and the medicine of another and the old poems of a third are all pages of one book and ought to be bound together and kept, and the kings of Alexandria set out, in a plain and practical way, to actually do it. To make the dream a building, and the building a working place, they raised what they called the Museion, which is a word we still carry, worn down and softened, in our own word museum, though it meant something rather different then and rather grander. It meant a shrine, a holy place, of the Muses, the 9 daughters of memory who were thought to breathe the gift of poetry and music and history and the sciences down into the minds of mortals, and so the Museion was in name a temple. A sacred precinct given over to those goddesses, but in fact, in daily fact, it was something the ancient world had scarcely seen before, and something we would recognise at once, because it was, near enough, a research institute, a university without students, a great state-funded college of scholars whose only duty was to think and to study and to write. The kings paid for it entirely. They brought the finest minds they could find from all around the Greek-speaking world, wrote to them, courted them, offered them a life most scholars can only dream of, and settled them there in the palace quarter by the sea, gave them their board and their lodging and a salary from the crown, freed them from taxes, freed them from the ordinary need to earn a living at all, and asked of them in return only that they stay, and study, and add to the store of what was known. And so they lived, these scholars, gathered together in a way that must have been intoxicating for a certain kind of person. Dozens of the sharpest people alive under one set of colonnades, and we are told there was a great communal dining hall where they took their meals together and argued and talked. the sort of talk you would give a great deal to have overheard, and covered walkways of marble where a man could pace up and down in the shade with a problem turning in his head, and rooms set aside for lectures and for reading, and gardens perhaps, and quiet and always close at hand, growing year upon year, the books. Because beside the Mousillon and bound up with it was the library itself, the collection, the thing the whole enterprise existed to feed and to serve, long halls we may imagine, lined floor to ceiling with row upon row of wooden pigeonhole shelving, and in each niche of that shelving the rolled cylinders of papyrus scrolls stacked like bottles in a rack, each scroll a pale tube, the colour of old honey and old bone, with a little tag hanging from its end on which was written the name of the work and its author, so that a scholar walking the aisles with a lamp could read the tags and find his way to the one voice out of the hundreds of thousands that he needed to hear that night. Now, how do you fill such shelves? How do you actually go about the mad and magnificent task of gathering every book in the world? And here the Ptolemies were not gentle dreamers at all, but hard, determined, and by our lights not entirely honest collectors. And the stories of how they hunted books are some of the most human and telling things we know about the whole place. They sent agents out with the king's money to every port and every city and every book market in the known world, to Athens and to Rhodes and wherever else scrolls were bought and sold, with instructions to buy and buy whatever they could find, old copies and rare copies and copies of copies, and ship them home to Alexandria. That is the ordinary way, the honest way, and they did a great deal of it. But they did more than that, and here the collecting turns almost piratical, because there was a law or a custom with the force of law that when any ship at all put in at the great harbour of Alexandria, no matter where it was from or what its business, the officials of the crown would come aboard and search it, not for contraband or for tax, but for books. And any scroll found on board any ship, in any traveller's baggage, was taken, carried up to the library, and there copied out fresh by the scribes, and then, and this is the sharp little twist of it, the beautiful new copy was returned to the owner, and the original was kept for the shelves, added to the hoard, and the works gathered in by this method were noted down in the catalogue with a phrase that has come across the centuries to us. They were marked as the books from the ships, so that even now, reading that dry little label, you can feel the salt and the suspicion and the sheer acquisitive hunger of the place, a whole harbour turned into a net for catching words. And there is one story, the best of them, that shows just how far that hunger would reach, and it concerns the city of Athens and the great tragedies, the plays of the three master playwrights whose works the Athenians treasured above almost anything they owned. Athens kept official master copies of those plays, careful authoritative texts held by the state as a kind of treasure, and one of the Ptolemies wished of course to have them for Alexandria, and so he asked to borrow them, merely to copy, and to reassure the wary Athenians he put down an enormous sum of silver as a deposit, a bond, a promise that the precious originals would come safely home, and the Athenians, trusting the bond, sent their treasures south across the sea. And the king had them copied, splendidly, on the finest papyrus, and then he sent back to Athens the copies, and kept the originals, and let the whole vast fortune of his deposit go, forfeited it without a blink, counting the plays cheap at the price, and I find I cannot entirely disapprove, which is a shameful thing to admit, but there is something in that reckless preferring of the true old text above a mountain of silver that tells you exactly what kind of madness ran this place, and it was a good madness, a madness for the real thing, for the authentic word set down by the hand that first shaped it. But a heap of scrolls, however vast, is not yet a library, it is only a hoard, and a hoard you cannot search is very nearly as useless as no hoard at all. For what good is owning every book in the world if you cannot lay your hand on the one you want? And so the greatest of the early achievements of that place, and to my mind one of the quietly heroic labours of the whole ancient world, was not the gathering of the scrolls at all, but the ordering of them, the making of the great catalogue. A scholar-poet who worked there set himself the staggering task of going through the whole collection and listing it. And not merely listing it, but arranging it, sorting the countless works by their kind, the poets here and the orators there, and the writers of medicine and law and history and mathematics each in their own division, and within each division setting the authors in order, and for each author giving his name and something of his life and the titles of his works and even, we are told, the opening words of each, so that any role could be told from any other, and this immense finding list, this map of the whole world of writing, ran itself to many scrolls, a great work in its own right. And it meant that the library was no longer a hoard, but a genuine instrument, a thing you could use, a mind you could question and have answer you. And it is very nearly the first time in the history of our kind that anyone had tried to draw a map of the whole of what was known. To stand back and take the measure of human knowledge as a single country, with borders and regions and roads. And I think it is a more wonderful thing than any pyramid, and almost nobody remembers the man who did it. And under that same lamplit roof, or walking those same colonnades by the sea, the scholars the kings had gathered did work that we have not bettered so much as we like to think, and I will give you only a little of it, at the pace of the night, so that you feel the place was alive, and not a warehouse. There was a man there, the keeper of the library in his day, a lean and thoughtful geometer, who did a thing so simple and so audacious that it still stops the breath a little when you follow it through. He measured the size of the whole earth, the round circumference of the entire world, without ever leaving Egypt, using nothing but shadows, and a well, and the reach of his own mind. For he had learned that far to the south, in a town up the river, on one certain day of the year, at noon, the sun stood so exactly overhead that its light went straight down to the very bottom of a deep well, and threw no shadow at all. The sun looking, for that one moment, directly down the throat of the earth, and he knew that on that same day, at that same noon, in Alexandria to the north, an upright post did cast a shadow, a short one, and he had only to measure the small angle of that shadow, and to know how far it was from his city to the town by the well. And then, with a piece of reasoning about circles that a patient child can follow, and that no one before him had quite thought to apply to the whole globe, he could swing that little measured angle all the way round the sphere of the world, and arrive at the size of the earth entire. And he did it. And the number he reached, when we turn his old measures into ours as best we can, is astonishingly, almost impossibly close to the truth. Close enough that we argue only about how close, standing there 2,000 years too late to shake his hand. And some of that company turned their study not outward to the sky or the earth at all, but inward, to the body, to the fragile and secret architecture of the human frame, and in those early Alexandrian years the physicians who gathered there learnt more of how a person is actually built than anyone before them had dared to learn, tracing the pathways of the nerves and setting apart, for the first time clearly, the nerves that carry feeling and thought from the vessels that carry the blood, following the beat of the pulse and the branching roads of the arteries, giving names to parts of us that had never been named, understanding that thinking and sensing were seated somehow in the brain, and not, as many had long supposed, in the heart. And though some of the ways they came by that knowledge would trouble us now, and I will not dwell on them in the dark, the plain fact is that a great deal of what the ancient and the medieval world would go on to believe about medicine, for good and sometimes for ill, was first set down in that city by that gathered company and copied onto those honey-coloured rolls. And others of that company mapped not the earth but the sky, and set themselves to the patient nightly work of the stars, watching and recording and measuring the wheeling lights, beginning the long labour of writing down where each star stood and how bright it shone, and how the whole slow machine of the heavens turned, laying groundwork that later astronomers, some of them working in that very city in the centuries to come, would build upon into systems that governed how our whole civilization pictured the cosmos for more than 1,000 years after, and still others bent over the oldest and most beloved poems of their people, the two great epics of the war at Troy and the long voyage home, comparing the many differing copies that had drifted down through the generations, each scribe's small slip breeding another, until no two rolls quite agreed, and working line by patient line to sift the true text from the corrupt, to mark the doubtful passages, to give back to the world a cleaner and more trustworthy version of the songs that lay at the very root of everything the Greeks were. And it is because of that unglamorous, squinting, comparing labour carried out under the oil lamps of Alexandria by men whose eyes must have ached, that we have those poems in as good a shape as we do, that the words have come down to us at all across the drop of the millennia. That is the kind of place it was. Not a tomb of dead books, but a workshop of living minds. A place where the earth was weighed, and the stars were counted, and the oldest songs were mended, all in one quarter of one city, all paid for by kings who understood, as too few of the powerful ever have, that of all the things a state can buy, the keeping and the growing of knowledge is the one that pays the longest dividend and casts the longest shadow down the years. And now we come to the question everyone asks, the one you are perhaps waiting for, which is simply, how big was it? How many scrolls stood on those shelves at the height of it all? And here I must keep the promise I made to you at the start of the night, and be honest even when honesty is less satisfying than a good round number would be. Because the truth is that we do not know, and we cannot know, and the ancient writers who tried to tell us do not agree with one another, and did not, most of them, ever count. The figures that have come down to us swing wildly, from tens of thousands at the low end, to 400,000, to 500,000, to as high as 700,000 scrolls at the very top of the boldest claims, and these numbers were written down. For the most part by men living long after the fact, repeating a marvel they had heard, reaching for a figure large enough to carry the awe they felt. The way we ourselves will say a crowd was in the thousands, when we truly mean only that it was very large, and there is a further tangle in it, which is that a scroll is not a book as we mean a book. For a single long work might be divided across many scrolls, a great history filling dozens of separate rolls, so that even if we had a firm count of the scrolls we would not have a firm count of the works, and the two numbers pull apart in ways we can no longer trace. So when you hear it said, with great confidence, that the Library of Alexandria held exactly this many books, and that exactly so many were lost, I would gently have you remember tonight that no one alive knows the number, that no true inventory of it survives, that we are reading the awe of the ancients and not their ledgers, and it does not matter, in the end, whether it was 100,000 or 7, because either way it was more of the written mind of humanity gathered in one place than had ever been gathered before, and the losing of any part of it would be a grief, and we do not need to inflate the figure to feel that grief rightly. And there was not one collection but 2, which is a thing worth holding on to now, quietly, because it will matter later when we come to the years the myth loves, for as the main library by the palace grew so great. A second and smaller collection was established elsewhere in the city, a daughter library, housed up on a hill within the precinct of a grand temple called the Serapeum, a great pagan sanctuary of pale columns and broad stone steps, with a colossal seated statue of a bearded god within, standing high above the rooftops of Alexandria, and this daughter collection off in its temple on its hill, apart from the great mother hoard down by the sea, was a separate thing in a separate place, and you would do well to keep the two of them distinct in your mind as you drift. The great library in the royal quarter, and the smaller one up at the temple. Because centuries from now, when men come to tell the story of the burning, they will blur the two together into one, and much of the confusion that has come down to us is born in that blurring. But all of that is far ahead, and there is no need to hurry toward it tonight. Hold the place, instead, at its height, at its noon, in the years when everything was still gathering and nothing yet had begun to slip away. Hold it full and lamplit and busy in the warm dark, the long halls lined with their honey-coloured scrolls, each in its niche with its little tag, the oil lamps pooling their soft gold light on the worn stone floors, the tall arched openings looking out across the quays to the dark calm water of the harbour, and the great fire of the lighthouse burning steady on its island beyond, the geometer bent over his circles and his shadows, the star watchers up on some flat roof with the whole turning sky above them, the mender of old poems squinting at his rival copies, the copying scribes seated cross-legged with the rolls across their knees and their reed pens moving. The whole company of them fed and housed and paid and left in peace to do nothing in all their days but think and read and add, one careful roll at a time, to the greatest gathering of human words the world had yet seen. That is the summit. That is the top of the long hill, the place from which, in every chapter still to come, the road will run only gently and quietly downward. Nothing is burning, nothing is lost. The lamps are lit, the shelves are full, the scholars are at their work, and the harbour is calm under the stars, and we will let it stand there, whole and glowing, and at its zenith, and go no further tonight, and rest a while in the warm certainty of it, before we ever let the first small shadow fall. So that is the place at its height, and I want you to keep it there in your mind for just a little while longer, warm and lamplit and full of low voices, the shelves stacked to their tall ceilings, the scholars bent over their scrolls, the sea moving quietly beyond the arches. Because now the shadow comes, and it comes with a name and a date and a fire, and it is the first place in all this long story where the picture you were, handed as a child, begins, very gently, to come apart in your hands. The year is 48 before the Common Era. Nearly 3 centuries have passed since the first Ptolemy dreamed his dream of gathering every book on earth beneath one roof, and in those 3 centuries the library has done more or less everything a library could be asked to do. And the city around it has grown rich and crowded and quarrelsome, and the dynasty that founded it has grown tired, the way dynasties do, thinning into feuds and poisonings and brothers marrying sisters and murdering them, until the whole royal house has become a small vicious storm of ambition huddled in a marble palace by the water. And into that storm, in the autumn of that year, comes a Roman. He is a lean, clean-shaven man in his early 50s, his dark hair combed forward over a high forehead that is beginning to lose its hair, and he has come to Egypt chasing the last threads of a civil war that has torn his own republic in half, and he has come with far too few soldiers, and he has walked, almost without meaning to, straight into the middle of the Ptolemies' own family war, a war between a young king and his older sister over who shall wear the diadem of Egypt. You may know their names. Tonight it does not much matter that you do. What matters is that this Roman general, with his handful of legionaries, takes the sisters' side, and installs himself in the royal quarter of the city right down by the harbour and the young king's army, which is very large and very angry, comes down to the water to throw him out. And so the Roman is besieged. He is pinned in the palace district on the edge of the sea, outnumbered, cut off, with the enemy in the streets behind him and the enemy fleet in the harbour before him, and it is a genuinely desperate hour. The kind of tight corner this particular general spent his whole life walking into and out of again, and he does what a soldier does when a fleet is about to be used against him. He burns it. He gives the order, and fire is carried out to the ships riding at anchor in the great harbour, the enemy's warships, and they catch, and they burn, and here is where the story you know begins to lift its head. Because fire on water does not always stay on the water. The flames, the tail goes, leap from the burning ships to the wooden dockside, and from the dockside to the warehouses along the quay, and from the warehouses climbing, spreading, unstoppable, up into the city itself, and up at last into the long colonnaded halls of the great library, until the shelves themselves are burning, the pigeonholes of cedar and pine going up row upon row, and the scrolls inside them, hundreds of thousands of them, every one a honey-coloured cylinder of somebody's lifetime of thought, curling and blackening and lifting into the night sky as ash, and drifting glowing embers out over the dark harbour water. And by morning, the story says, it is gone, the whole of it. The dream of the Ptolemies, the gathered mind of the ancient world, reduced in a single night by a single soldier's single order to a smear of grey ash on the wet stones. That is the version. That is the vivid, terrible, cinematic version, and I will not pretend it has no power, because it has a great deal of power, and there is even a version of you, lying there in the quiet, who half remembers being told it, and who feels at the thought of it. That particular ache we feel for things burned that can never be got back. But I made you a promise at the start of tonight, and I mean to keep it all the way through, and the promise was this: that where the story and the evidence part company, I will stop and slow down and tell you plainly what we actually know and how we know it and where it runs out, and I will not dress up a guess in the clothes of a fact and hand it to you in the dark. And so we are going to stop here, right here on the burning quay, and we are going to do something that the cinematic version never does. We are going to go and read the witnesses. Because there are witnesses, or there are people we call witnesses. The ancient writers who tell us about this fire, and the whole secret of this chapter, the thing I most want you to carry away from it, is not any single fact about the fire at all. It is the way these witnesses disagree with one another. It is the sound of them not quite lining up. Once you have heard that sound, you can never quite unhear it, and it changes how you listen to every confident story anyone ever tells you about the ancient world. So let us listen. And the first witness we ought to call, the very first, the one with the best possible claim to know what happened, is the general himself. Because this Roman was not only a soldier, he was a writer, a famously clear and spare and self-serving writer, and he wrote his own account of these very wars, in his own words, in the third person, in that cool, dry military prose of his. And that account survives, and we can read it tonight, and in it he describes this exact campaign, the siege, the desperate corner, the fire he set among the enemy ships. He tells us he burned the fleet. He is not shy about it. It was good soldiering and he was proud of it. And then, having told us he set the harbour ablaze, he says nothing. Nothing at all. Not one word about a library, not one word about the greatest collection of books in the world going up in flames a few streets from where he stood. Now think about that for a moment, gently, the way you would turn a smooth stone over in your hand. Here is a man who set the fire, who was there, who wrote it all down, who had every reason in the world to either boast of a great victory or, if he had accidentally destroyed the most famous building of learning on earth, to explain it away, to soften it, to blame the enemy for forcing his hand. And instead there is only silence, the flat silence of a man who does not seem to think anything of that sort happened at all. That silence is our first thread, and it is a loud one. And the second witness we should call is a Greek geographer, a careful, sober, much-travelled man who came to Alexandria himself, perhaps 20 years or so after this fire, in the flesh, and walked its streets, and wrote a long and detailed description of the city as he found it, quarter by quarter, building by building. He describes the royal district. He describes the Museion, the great institution of the scholars, with its covered walk and its dining hall and its scholars, describing it in the present tense as a thing that is there, functioning, alive, as he stands and looks at it. And he too says nothing of a fire that destroyed it. He does not write, "Here is where the great library stood before it burned." He writes as a man describing a working city, and the working city he describes still has its house of the Muses standing in it. A traveller who came, who looked, who wrote it down, and who saw no ruin where the ruin is supposed to be. That is our second thread, and now the two of them together are beginning to pull. And so where, you may be starting to wonder, does the fire in the library actually come from, if the man who lit it and the man who came and looked both fail to mention it? And the answer is that it comes later, always later, from writers who were not there, who lived generations, and in some cases centuries after the night in question, and this is where you must hold on gently to the shape of the thing, because it is the shape that matters. The earliest surviving writer to connect the general's fire with a loss of books is a Roman philosopher writing perhaps 100 years afterward, and what he says is small and oddly specific. He says that 40,000 scrolls burned at Alexandria in that fire. 40,000. Hold on to that number, because we are going to watch it grow. Then, generations further on, another writer, a collector of curious learned facts, tells the story again, and in his telling it is no longer 40,000, it is 700,000 volumes, and they are the whole of the library, and they are all lost. And another late writer, a soldier historian writing well over 300 years after the fire, repeats that same enormous figure, 700,000 gone, and a Greek biographer, writing his famous life of the general more than a century and a half after the man was dust, gives us the most vivid and quotable line of all, the line that launched 1,000 retellings, that the fire, spreading from the dockyards, destroyed the great library. It is a wonderful, memorable sentence, and it is very late, and it is written by a man whose gift and whose whole purpose was to tell a shapely, moving, moral story about a great man's life, not to file a report. Do you hear it now, the sound I promised you? 40,000 becomes 400,000 becomes 700,000. A vague mention of burned books, written a century on, hardens over the following centuries into the confident total destruction of the greatest library on earth. The number swells with each retelling the way a fish swells in the telling of the man who caught it, and the certainty swells right along with the number, so that the writers furthest from the event, the ones with the very least possible way of knowing, are precisely the ones who speak with the most ringing confidence about exactly how much was lost. This is almost the reverse of how knowledge is supposed to work. And it gets stranger still, and gentler and more interesting, when you notice that even among these later writers, the ones who do at last describe a great burning, they cannot agree on what actually caught fire. Because there is another thread here, a quieter and more mundane one, that I think is closer to the truth of that night than any of the grand ones, and it comes from a Roman historian who tells us that what burned by the harbour that evening was not the halls of the library at all, but warehouses. Storehouses down on the dockside, and in them, along with the grain and the goods of a great trading port, were books. Books stacked and crated and waiting to be shipped out, copies bound for export, or perhaps copies newly bought and not yet carried up to the shelves. The ordinary overflow of the busiest book town in the world, sitting in a warehouse by the water where the fire could reach them. And that, you see, is an entirely different picture from the one you were handed. That is not the mind of the ancient world going up in a single tragic pyre. That is a dockside warehouse of stock, catching light in the confusion of a siege. A real loss, a genuine loss, 40,000 scrolls is no small thing, and I will not pretend it is. Someone's labour and someone's learning did burn on the quay that night, and we may honestly mourn it. But it is a warehouse fire. It is not the death of the library. The library, the actual institution, the halls and the shelves and the scholars up in the royal quarter, may very well not have been touched by those flames at all, and the very earliest and best witnesses, the general and the geographer, give us every reason to think it was not. And I want to pause here and be tender for a moment about why the big version, the total destruction version, took such deep root in us anyway. Why it is the one we were handed and not the small true one about the warehouse, because I do not think it is because anyone lied to us. And I do not think it is because people are foolish. I think it is because the single fire story gives us something the true story withholds, and that something is a clean grief. It gives us a night to mourn, a definite before and a definite after, a moment you could point to on a calendar and say, there, that is when the light went out, and it gives us, if we want it, a face to blame, a single hand that held the torch, so that all the ache of everything lost from the ancient world, all the plays we do not have, and the histories that end mid-sentence, and the poems we know only because someone once quoted 4 lines of them, all of that vast and diffuse and unbearable loss can be gathered up and set down on one man's shoulders on one terrible night, and grief is so much easier to carry when it has a shape and an hour and a name. The trouble is only that it is not true, or not true in that shape, and the truth, as it so often is, turns out to be at once sadder and gentler than the story. Sadder because there was no single night, and so no single night can be undone even in imagination, and gentler because a loss with no villain in it is also a loss with no hatred in it, only time, and weather, and forgetting, which are things we can perhaps forgive more easily than we can forgive a torch. And there is one more quiet fact that stands squarely against the whole idea of a single fire ending everything, and it is a fact about how books actually lived in the ancient world, and it is oddly comforting to hold on a night like this. A great collection was never truly all in one place. The very habit that built the library, the endless copying, the agents in every port, the scrolls bought and duplicated and traded, meant that the important texts of the ancient world existed in many copies, in many cities, in Athens and Pergamon, and Rhodes, and Rome, and 100 smaller towns with their own smaller libraries and their own book-loving households. The great works were not single precious originals that one flame could erase from the world. They were seeds already scattered wide across the whole Mediterranean, and a fire in one warehouse in one harbour, however sad, could no more end them than a single fallen tree can end a forest that has already dropped its seed across a whole country. This is a thread we will follow all the way to the end of tonight, and it is the most consoling thread of all, so tuck it away somewhere warm and keep it. The knowledge was never only in the building. So let me stop now and do the thing I promised, and say plainly where we stand, because this is exactly the kind of night, and exactly the kind of question, where the honest answer is worth more than the exciting one. Here is what we can say. Something burned by the harbour of Alexandria in that autumn of 48. The general set a fleet alight, and fire in a crowded ancient port is a terrible, spreading, hungry thing, and it is entirely likely that it reached the dockside, and quite possible that among the things it reached were books. Thousands of them, waiting in warehouses near the water. That much the evidence will carry, gently, without straining. But the other claim, the big one, the one the story is really made of, that the great library itself burned that night, that the whole gathered collection was consumed, that the mind of the ancient world ended in those few hours by that one man's one order, that claim. The evidence simply will not carry, and I am not going to make it carry it. It rests on writers who were not there, who wrote long afterward, who cannot agree on the number or even on the building, and it is contradicted, quietly but firmly, by the two people best placed of all to have known, one of whom lit the fire, and one of whom walked the streets a generation later and found the scholars still at their work. And that quiet contradiction, brings us to the single most decisive thing in this whole chapter, the receipt that settles it more surely than any counting of scrolls, and it is beautifully simple, and once you see it you will wonder how the story of the one-night fire ever stood at all. It is this. Alexandria went on, after 48, after the fire, after the siege, after the general sailed away, and the dust of that little war settled. The city did not become a place of ruined learning haunted by the ghost of a burned library. It went on being, for centuries, one of the very greatest centres of thought and study in the entire world. The scholars kept coming, the scholars kept working, in the very halls that were supposedly ash, in the generations after this fire that was supposed to have ended everything. Some of the most important minds of the ancient world lived and taught and wrote in Alexandria. The greatest astronomer of antiquity, the man whose model of the heavens would govern how human beings understood the sky for 1400 years, did his work in Alexandria more than a century after this fire. The most influential physician of the ancient world came to Alexandria to study, drawn there precisely because it was still the place you went to learn, still the place where the books and the teachers were, generations after the flames. Great mathematicians, great geographers, great commentators on the old texts, on, century after century, an unbroken line of Alexandrian learning stretching down through the Roman age. There were inventors there in the generations after the fire, men who built machines that hissed and turned with steam and air and water, toys and temple marvels, and the first sketches of ideas that would not come round again for a millennium and a half. There were the great editors and grammarians who went on doing what the library had always done best, tending the old texts, comparing the copies, arguing in the margins over a single doubtful word in a line of Homer. Exactly the patient-loving work that the founding kings had paid for 300 years before, still being done in the same city by the same lamplight for centuries after the night it all supposedly ended. The traveller who came and looked 20 years after the fire and found the scholars at their desks was not looking at an exception or a brief revival. He was looking at the ordinary continuing life of a place that had not, in fact, died, and that continuing life ran on and on past him, down through emperor after emperor, so that when you lay the 4 centuries of it out end to end, the supposed Great Death in 48 looks less like a death and more like a single bad winter in the long life of an old tree that leafed out again, every single spring that followed. And I want you to sit with the plain logic of that, because it is gentle and it is complete. A library that has truly been destroyed cannot go on being the reason the whole world sends its brightest young people to your city to study. A collection that has genuinely burned to ash does not keep producing, for 400 more years, the scholars who define their fields. If the great library had really died in one night in 48, the 4 centuries of magnificent Alexandrian scholarship that came after it would be impossible. And yet there they are, undeniable. In the works we still read, the star tables and the medical treatises and the commentaries. The city's learning did not end with the fire. It barely paused, and a thing that barely pauses has not been killed. So here is where I want to leave you tonight, at the end of this first wound, and I want to leave you settled, not troubled. Because I think the true version is actually the kinder one to fall asleep inside of. The Great Fire of 48, the one so many of us were taught to see as the end, was not the end. It was, at most, a wound, a real one, a warehouse of scrolls by the water, a bad night in a long siege, a genuine loss grieved by the people who lived through it, and then, like most losses, absorbed and carried and outlived. The library, the true library, the living institution of shelves and scholars and lamplight, very likely stood through that night more or less intact, and certainly stood, in one form or another, for a great while after it, humming on into the Roman centuries with its work not yet done. The single torch did not undo 300 years of gathering. The one villain the story wants, the man with the order and the flame, is not the man who ended this place. Nobody's single order ended this place, and that, quietly, is the first great crack in the picture you were handed. The first place where the neat story of the one night and the one fire and the one guilty hand simply fails to match the receipts, and once that crack is open, the whole shape of the true story begins to show through it. And the shape is this: that the real dying, when it came, would not come like a fire at all. It would come with no flames to point at, and no single knight to blame, and no villain to hang the loss upon. It would come so slowly, and so quietly, and so utterly without drama, that hardly anyone alive at the time would even have noticed it was happening. And that, the long, soft, unwatched dying, the true one, the one the story never tells because there is no torch in it to light the scene, is where we are going next. So the fire by the harbour burned itself out, and the smoke thinned over the water, and the scholars who had been woken by the noise went back, in the days that followed, to their reading rooms and their lamp-lit desks. Because the place was still there, and the work was still waiting, and that is the first thing I want you to hold on to as we step now into the strangest part of the whole story, the part the myth cannot use, and so leaves out entirely. Because a myth needs a knight. It needs a villain with a torch and a wind off the sea. It needs flames climbing the shelves and a single terrible hour after which everything is gone, and I understand exactly why. For a night like that is easy to remember and easy to be angry about, and easy to tell your children. But the truth of how the Great Library actually died has no such night in it, or rather it has 1,000 small nights, none of them dramatic, spread out across so many quiet years that no single one of them would look like a death at all if you had been standing in the room. This is the long middle of our story, and I will not pretend to you that it is exciting, because it is not, and I think the fact that it is not exciting is the most important and the most consoling thing I can teach you tonight. So let me slow us right down, slower even than we have gone so far, to the pace of the thing itself, which is the pace of dust settling on a high shelf that no one has reached up to for a while. And let me take out the little contract we made at the very start, the one I laid on the table in the harbour and promised to keep all night, that where the evidence thins I will stop and tell you so, and where the old writers fall silent I will not fill the silence with invention. Because this chapter, more than any other, is a chapter of thin evidence and long silence, and the honest thing, the thing I owe you, is to describe the silence truthfully rather than paint a fire across it just to keep you entertained. There is no fire here, there is only the slow letting go. Come and sit with it a while, it will not hurt you. It is, in the end, the most human thing in this entire tale. Begin with money, because that is where the fading really begins, and it is a very ordinary place to begin. The library was never, at any moment of its life, a thing that grew wild on its own. It was not a forest. It was a garden, and a garden is only ever as alive as the hands that tend it, and the hands that tended this one were royal hands, the hands of the Ptolemies, that long line of Macedonian Greek kings who had inherited Egypt and its grain and its gold, and had chosen, for reasons of pride and vision both, to pour a river of that gold into the gathering and keeping of books. The salaries of the scholars came from the crown, the copying of the scrolls, the buying of them in distant ports, the papyrus itself, the lamp oil, the very roof over the reading rooms, all of it was paid for out of the king's own purse, year upon year, as a matter of settled habit. The way you might keep a lamp burning in a window, because your family has always kept a lamp burning in that window. And for the first 2 or 3 generations the kings kept the lamp trimmed and bright, because the library was their glory, their answer to Athens, the jewel that made their new city the brain of the whole known world. But dynasties are living things too, and they tire, and they quarrel, and they turn their eyes to nearer troubles. And the later Ptolemies were not the first Ptolemies. They had civil wars to fund, and armies to pay, and brothers and sisters to murder, and Rome, always Rome, growing in the west like a shadow at evening, needing to be flattered and bribed and appeased. And a scholarship budget, you will find, is a very quiet thing to cut. No one riots when a salaried grammarian in a marble hall is quietly not replaced after he dies. No wall falls down. No enemy is at the gate. The shelves look exactly the same the morning after the money stops as they did the morning before. That is the treachery of it, and I want you to feel that treachery gently, because it is the same treachery that eats quietly at every good and unguarded thing in every age, including our own. The decline of the library did not announce itself. It arrived as an absence, a post left unfilled, an acquisition trip not funded, a worn-out scroll not recopied, and absences make no sound. Now let me give you the one moment in this long fading that does have an edge to it, because the honest record does hold one, and I will tell it to you plainly and then tell you just as plainly what we do not know about it. Somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century, before our era, under one of those later kings, a heavy, scheming, much hated Ptolemy whom his own subjects nicknamed with cruel affection after the swollen shape of his body, there came a purge. The details are murky, and I will not dress them up, but the shape of it is this. In the aftermath of one of the dynasty's ugly internal wars, the king turned on the Greek intellectual class of Alexandria, the scholars and the teachers who had, as scholars and teachers will, taken the wrong side or no side or simply been resented for their learning, and he drove them out. He expelled them from the city. And the men of the Musion, the philologists and the astronomers and the physicians and the geographers, packed what they could carry, and went, to Athens, to Rhodes, to Pergamon, to the islands, to whatever court or school across the Greek-speaking sea would take a displaced man of letters and feed him. And here, if this were the myth, I would tell you that this was the death of learning in Alexandria, and I would be wrong, and worse than wrong, I would be missing the one beautiful thing in the whole grim episode. Because listen to what actually happened when those scholars scattered. They did not stop being scholars. They did not burn their knowledge on the way out of the gate. They carried it. Each one of them was himself a kind of living library, a walking copy of everything he had learnt in those halls, and when he arrived, dusty and unwelcome, at some smaller school on some smaller island, he began at once to teach, and to write, and to train new pupils. And so the learning that Alexandria had gathered so jealously under one roof was, by the very act of Alexandria throwing it away, sown out broadcast across the entire Greek world like seed flung from an angry hand. Scholars of that age themselves noticed this and remarked on it, that the tyrant's cruelty had, against all his intent, enriched the schools of the whole Mediterranean. I find this almost unbearably tender, and I want you to carry it with you into the dark parts still ahead of us, because it is the first appearance of the deepest truth of this entire night, the truth we will arrive at properly at the very end, that knowledge held in one place can be destroyed in one place, but knowledge that has been copied and carried and taught into other living minds cannot be gathered up and burned, because it is no longer in any one place to be burned. The purge that hollowed the centre watered the edges. Hold that. We will need it. But hold too, because honesty demands it, the other half of the truth, which is that the centre was indeed hollowed. Alexandria kept its library and its museion after the scholars were driven out. Some returned, in time, and new men came, and the lamps were relit, but a garden that has been stripped once is never quite so full again, and the pattern had been set, the terrible lesson taught, that the crown's protection was not eternal, that the scholar's chair could be pulled from under him by a king's bad temper, that the great safe place was not, after all, entirely safe. And then came Rome. I will not walk you through the wars and the queens and the last desperate Ptolemies, because that is another night's story and a noisier one, but the end of it is that Egypt fell out of the hands of its Greek kings and into the hands of the Roman emperors, and Alexandria became a city of the empire, a jewel in someone else's crown, and the library and the museion came under Roman care. And here is a thing worth saying clearly and fairly, against the grain of the sad story I am telling. Rome did not hate the library. The early emperors were, some of them, proud of it, and kept it up, and the museion went on, and scholars went on drawing their stipends, now from an imperial treasury rather than a royal one. And famous men of learning went on doing famous work in Alexandria. For centuries I told you this at the end of our last hour, and I will not let you forget it, because it is the single hardest fact for the myth to swallow. The place kept working. A library that had truly burned to ash in a harbour fire could not have gone on producing celebrated scholars for 400 more years, and it did. So the Roman centuries were not a death either. But they were, slowly, a diminishment, and the diminishment is the thing I need you to understand. Because it is subtle, and it is real. Under Rome the museion became less a wild engine of discovery, and more an honour, a comfortable membership, a set of tax-exempt seats that emperors could grant as favours to men they liked. Not always men who deserved them for their learning. The privileges that had made it a magnet for the sharpest minds of the world were eroded, granted and revoked at imperial whim, and at least one emperor is remembered for meddling in its membership out of pique. The funding was no longer the boundless river of a king who staked his glory on it, but a line in a distant empire's accounts, and distant empires have many lines and many wars and many reasons to trim. And a research institution that becomes an honour rather than an engine, that rewards the well-connected rather than the brilliant, that is funded out of habit rather than passion, such an institution does not fall. It simply, slowly, stops mattering as much as it did, and the best young minds, who can smell where the life is, begin to go elsewhere, to Athens still, or to the new schools rising in the east. And the halls that once hummed grow a little quieter each generation. And the quiet is not tragic. It is not even sad exactly. It is just less. A little less. And then a little less again. The way a fire that no one feeds does not go out with a bang, but simply subsides, coal by coal, into a warm grey bed of ash that still glows if you look, but throws no heat into the room. That is the Moussion under Rome. Still there, still glowing, throwing less and less heat. Now I must introduce you to the true villains of this story, because I have been circling them and it is time to name them. And they are not villains at all in the way the myth wants villains, which is why the myth cannot bear to name them. There is no torch here, no mob, no wicked general. There are only 4 things, and all 4 of them are boring, and all 4 of them are patient, and all 4 of them are, in the end, far more deadly to a library than any fire that ever burned. The first is the budget, and I have already shown him to you. The quiet cut, the unfilled post, the absence that makes no sound. The second is neglect. His close brother, not a decision to destroy, but the simple failure to keep tending, the reaching up to the high shelf that fewer and fewer hands bother to do. The third is fashion, and this one is craftier than the other 2, because fashion decides what is worth keeping. Tastes in learning change across centuries the way tastes in everything change. A subject that seemed vital to one age seems dusty and pointless to the next. Old poets fall out of favour, whole schools of thought come to seem quaint or wrong or simply dull. And when a scroll is worn and fraying, and a scribe must decide whether to spend the long labour of recopying it, the decision is made, always, in the taste of the moment. And the works the moment does not value are the works that do not get copied, and the works that do not get copied are the works that die. Not burned, just not chosen, just quietly allowed to crumble because no one living happened to think them worth the read and the ink. Whole libraries have died of nothing but changing fashion, and we do not mourn them, because we do not even know the names of what we lost, and that is fashion's particular cruelty. It erases the evidence of its own crime. But the 4th villain, the 4th, is the one I most want you to carry away from this hour, because he is the one no story ever tells, and he is the greatest killer of ancient books that has ever existed. Greater than every fire, and every conqueror, and every angry king combined, and his name is simply this: papyrus rots. Let me tell you about papyrus, gently, because to understand the death of the library, you must understand the flesh of it, and its flesh was papyrus. It is a marvellous material, made from the pith of a reed that grew in the Egyptian marshes, cut into strips and laid crosswise, and pressed and dried into a smooth pale sheet the colour of old honey and old bone, and joined edge to edge into a long roll and wound upon a rod, and it took ink beautifully, and it was light to hold, and a scholar could unroll it across his knees by lamplight and read. The mind of a man dead 1,000 years. But it is, at heart, dried vegetable matter, and dried vegetable matter wants only one thing in all the world, and that is to return to the soil it came from. It is not stone. It is not clay baked hard in a kiln that will outlast empires. It is a leaf, essentially, a pressed and written upon leaf, and a leaf, left to itself, does what leaves do. In the dry desert sands of Upper Egypt, buried away from the air, a papyrus can last thousands of years, and that is how we have any of them at all. But in a city, in a working library, in daily use, handled and unrolled and rolled again, and above all in the damp, and here is the knife of it, in the damp salt air of a Mediterranean harbour town, where the sea mist rolls in off the water every single night, and lies on everything, and creeps into every hall and every shelf and every fibre, papyrus does not last thousands of years. It lasts, at best, a few generations. 200 years, perhaps 3, if it is well kept and lucky. And then the honey-coloured sheet grows brittle, and spotted, and dark. The the fibres loosen. The edges crumble at a touch, the ink flakes, and one day a scroll that a scholar reaches for comes apart in his hands like a moth's wing, and the words that were on it, the thoughts of some long-dead mind, are simply gone, sifting down as pale dust onto the stone floor, and no fire was needed, and no villain came, and no one even noticed because it happened on a Tuesday. To one scroll, on one shelf, in silence. Do you see now what a library truly is? This is the thing I most need you to understand, and it is the opposite of what the word makes you picture. When you hear library, you think of a building, a solid thing, a fortress of knowledge that stands until something knocks it down. But that is exactly wrong. A library made of papyrus is not a fortress, and it is not solid, and it does not stand on its own for even a single century. It is a fountain. It is a thing that exists only so long as it is constantly, endlessly renewed. Only so long as, somewhere in a quiet room, a scribe is forever sitting cross-legged, with a fraying old roll across his knees and a fresh new roll beside it, copying. Letter by letter, word by word, day after day, keeping the words alive by pouring them out of the dying vessel and into a new one before the old one crumbles. That copying is not maintenance of the library. That copying is the library. The scrolls on the shelves are only the visible spray of the fountain. The true library is the ceaseless act of renewal that keeps replacing them faster than the damp can eat them. And a fountain, unlike a fortress, does not need to be attacked to fall silent. It only needs to be left unfed. Turn off the source, cut the budget that pays the copyists. Let the fashion turn away from the works that need copying. Let neglect thin the hands that do the work, and the fountain does not come crashing down. It simply, quietly stops, and the moment the copying slows, the moment there are fewer scribes than there are rotting scrolls, the library begins to die of its own nature, from the inside, shelf by shelf, in perfect silence, subtracting itself from the world one crumbled roll at a time, with the damp of the harbour doing the patient work that no torch ever could. That is what was happening in Alexandria through all these long centuries the myth skips over. Not a fire, a slowing of the fountain. The kings who had once paid armies of copyists were gone, the emperors trimmed, the fashion turned, the neglect grew. And behind it all, every night, forever, the sea mist came in off the harbour and lay upon the shelves, and did its silent, faithful, rotting work, and the scribes to answer it grew fewer, and so the scrolls that crumbled were not all replaced, and the collection began, very slowly, to shrink. Not to be destroyed. To shrink. To thin. To lose, here a poet and there a play and there a treatise on some forgotten science. The loss is invisible, unrecorded, unmourned, because who writes down the name of a book that simply was not there anymore when someone went to look for it 100 years on? And I want to be honest with you, as I promised, about how much of this we can actually see, because we can see very little of it directly, and that is the point. There is no chronicle of the fading. No ancient writer sat down and recorded, in this year we lost 40 scrolls to the damp. In that year the copying room was cut to 3 scribes. The silence is total, and the silence is itself the evidence, because a slow ordinary death leaves no records. Records are made of dramatic events, and there was nothing dramatic to record. What we can see is only the two ends of the fade, the library blazing at its height in the golden age we visited last, full to bursting, the wonder of the world, and then, centuries later, the near nothing, the shadow, the vague and shrunken remnant that the famous destruction stories of the 4th and the 7th centuries reach for and find already almost empty. Between those two ends lies the long grey middle, and across that middle the great collection quietly ebbed, and we cannot watch it ebb. We can only stand at the far shore and see that the tide, which was once so high, has gone very far out. So let me leave you here at the near end of that long middle, so that you are ready for what comes next. I want you to understand, before we ever reach the dramatic dates the myth loves, before the temple falls on its hill, before the philosopher is killed in the street, before the conqueror's soldiers are said to feed the furnaces, that by the time any of those things happen, the great library of Alexandria as it was in its glory is already, mostly, gone, not destroyed, faded, ebbed, emptied slowly by budgets and neglect and fashion, and above all by the patient rotting of papyrus in the salt damp air, until what remained was a diminished thing, a proud old name attached to a much smaller reality, a fountain running thin. The famous villains still to come did not kill a living giant. They arrived, each of them, to a place that was already mostly silence. And the myth's mistake, its beautiful, forgivable, entirely human mistake, is to have taken the last faint tremors of a thing that was already 3/4 gone and mistaken them for the moment of death. Because the human heart needs a moment of death, needs a night and a flame and a name to blame, and cannot bear the truer, quieter fact that the thing it loved did not die on any night at all, but faded across 600 years of nobody's fault in particular, of ordinary neglect and ordinary damp, unwatched, untended, and unmourned until it was far too late to mourn it well. Rest in that a moment. Let it be sad, but let it be a soft sadness, the kind you can sleep inside, because there is comfort waiting further on. I promised you comfort at the start, and I will keep that promise too. And the comfort is already hidden in this very chapter, in the scholars who scattered and carried their libraries in their heads, in the truth that what is copied and carried out into other minds can never be gathered up and burned. Keep that lamp lit in the back of your mind as we go on. But for now, simply lie still and let the long grey middle wash over you at its own slow pace, the pace of dust settling on a high shelf, the pace of mist coming in off a dark and patient harbour, and know that the loudest and most famous parts of the story are still ahead, and that when we reach them, you and we will already know the secret the myth has never learned, that the great fires everyone remembers came far too late to be the thing that mattered, and that the real dying was already long, long done. And so we come, you and I, out of those long, quiet centuries of fading, out of the slow, undramatic dying that no one ever paints, because there is no fire in it to paint. The budgets that thinned, the scholars who grew fewer, the scrolls that softened and browned and crumbled in the sea damp for want of hands to copy them. And we arrive now at the first of the great loud dates that the myth loves, the first place where the story you were told stands up out of the shadows and points and says, there, that year, that mob, that was the night they burned the library of Alexandria. The year is 391, and the place is not the old Museion down by the palaces at all, but a hill, and I want us to climb that hill together, slowly, in the failing light, because to understand what did and did not happen there, we first have to stand on it and feel how high it was and how much it mattered. You will remember from earlier in the night that there were 2 collections, not one, the great mother library in the royal quarter by the harbour, and a second, smaller daughter collection housed away from it, up in the temple precinct of the Serapeum. And it is the Serapeum, the daughter's house, that the mob will come for tonight, so let me build it for you before it falls. The way we always build a thing before we lose it, because a loss is only as heavy as the thing that was loved. The Serapeum stood on the one real rise in that flat sea-level city, on the Acropolis of Alexandria, so that it looked down over the honey-coloured rooftops and out across the harbour to the lighthouse, and it was, by every account that survives, one of the most beautiful buildings in the entire ancient world. The ancient writers reach, when they describe it, past all their usual restraint, and one of them says plainly that after the temple on the Capitol in Rome, there was nothing in the whole empire more splendid. Broad stone steps climbed to it, colonnades ran round it, court within court, the walls were faced and gilded and painted, and at the heart of it, in the dimness of the inner sanctuary, sat the god himself, Serapis, a maid god, a deliberately invented god from the very first Ptolemy's reign, half Greek and half Egyptian, stitched together 3 centuries before to give the new mixed city a face to pray to, and his statue was colossal, a seated bearded figure so vast that, the writers tell us. His outstretched hands brushed the two side walls of the shrine, carved and clad and dim-gleaming in the lamplight, with the grain measure of plenty upon his head. And around that god, in the porticos and the side chambers of his house, there had once been books. We know there had been books, because the earlier writers say so, and the popular belief, the belief that comes down to you and to me and to nearly everyone who has ever heard the phrase Library of Alexandria, is that on the day the temple came down, those books came down with it, that the crowd that broke the god also fed the shelves to the flames, and that this hilltop afternoon in the year 391 was the true and fiery death of the greatest library the world had ever known. That is the version. Let me build it for you honestly and fully, the way I built the great harbour fire honestly and fully before we took it apart, because you deserve the strong form of the story and not a straw one. The world had changed around the old temple. This was no longer the pagan Mediterranean of the Ptolemies and the early Caesars. The empire had turned Christian, turned decisively and from the top, and in the years just before our date the Emperor Theodosius had issued law after law against the old worship. No sacrifice, no incense, no entering the temples of the old gods. The doors of a 1,000-year-old religion swinging shut by imperial decree across the whole Roman world. And in Alexandria, the man who carried that turning tide was the bishop, Theophilus, an energetic and combative churchman who had obtained permission to take over a disused pagan shrine, and who, the pagan writers say, paraded the cult objects he found there through the streets to mock them. And the pagans of the city, who were many and old and proud and did not intend to be mocked, rose in fury. There was fighting in the streets, real fighting, blood on the stones, and the pagan party, getting the worst of it in the open city, fell back and up the steps of the Serapeum, up onto their holy hill, and barricaded themselves inside the great temple as into a fortress with hostages. The story goes, and with the god at their backs, and there they held under siege in the last redoubt of the old world, while word went to the emperor and the city held its breath. And the emperor's answer came back, and it was, in its way, merciful toward the men and merciless toward the gods. Pardon for the pagans who had killed in the fighting. Let them go. Let there be no martyrs. But the cause of the strife, the temples, the idols, were to come down. And so the doors were opened, and the soldiers and the crowd went in, and they came at last into the dim sanctuary, and stood before the colossus of Serapis that had sat there in the incense dark for 300 years. And there is a moment here that the sources all remember, because it is a genuinely human moment. A holding of the collective breath. It was believed by pagan and nervous Christian alike, that Serapis was bound up with the very order of the world, that his image was the pin that held the sky, and that if a hand were laid upon him in violence the heavens would crack, and the earth heave, and the light go out. And for a moment no one moved. And then a single soldier, braver or more impatient or simply less credulous than the rest, took up a double-headed axe and swung it with all his strength into the jaw of the god, and the sky did not fall. Nothing fell but the god. The great head came away. They say a colony of rats ran out from inside the hollow of the idol, which the crowd found bleakly funny, and then the whole colossus was hacked apart, limb by limb, the pieces dragged out through the city and burned in the public places, the trunk of it hauled to the amphitheatre and set alight before the people, so that the god who was supposed to end the world could not, in the end, defend his own face. And the temple itself was thrown down, the beautiful splendid temple, the second most splendid building in the empire, unroofed and gutted and given over. And in time a church would stand on that hill instead. That is the fall of the Serapeum, and it is not a myth, it happened, very nearly as I have told it, and it is one of the best attested single events in the whole of this long story. And it is exactly here, precisely at the top of that emotional climb, that I have to slow us down and keep the promise I made you at the very beginning of the night. The promise that where the evidence is strong we would lean on it hard, and where the evidence runs thin or runs silent we would stop and say so plainly, and not pretend to know what we do not know. Because notice what I have and have not just told you. I have told you the temple fell, and the god was broken, and the hill was taken. And every one of those things is nailed down by writers who lived within a decade of the event. But did you notice that in all of that vivid, well-attested, blow-by-blow account, I never once told you that the books burned. I never told you the shelves were emptied into the fire, or that scrolls fed the flames along with the trunk of the god, or that a library died on that hill that afternoon, and the reason I never told you is the quiet centre of this whole chapter. The thing I most want to lay in your hands before you sleep. The ancient writers who described the fall of the Serapeum, the men closest to it in time, the men who told us in loving and horrified detail about the axe and the jaw and the rats and the burning of the god, those same men do not mention a library at all. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, in the way you can sit with strange things at this hour without needing to solve them. The single best source we have for that day is a churchman named Rufinus, who wrote his account only about a decade later, who had actually lived in the East, who describes the interior of the Serapeum room by room as a man describes a place he has seen or heard of from those who saw it, the sanctuary, the god, the side chambers, the very fittings, and Rufinus, given every chance in the world to say and books beyond number were burned that day, does not say it. He does not mention books at all, nor does the historian Socrates, writing not long after, nor does Sozomen, and the pagan writer Eunapius, who loathed the Christians who did this, and would have wielded a burned library like a torch against them if he could, who mourns the temple bitterly as the death of his whole world, even he, in his grief and his fury, does not accuse them of burning the books, because the books, it seems, were simply not the story. The temple was the story. The god was the story. A way of life was the story. And here is the sober historical truth underneath the silence, and I will give it to you as honestly as I can, with its edges of not knowing left honestly rough. The daughter collection at the Serapeum, the books that had once genuinely been there, appear to have been gone, or nearly gone, long before that axe was ever swung. There is a Roman writer, a soldier historian named Ammianus Marcellinus, a careful and sober man, and he was describing Alexandria only a few years before the temple fell, and when he speaks of the libraries of the Serapeum, of the great collections gathered there, he speaks of them in the past tense, as a glory that had been, as something already belonging to an earlier and better age. Already, before the mob, before the edict, before the axe, the shelves on the hill were spoken of as a memory. And that should not surprise us at all, not after the night we have had, because it is precisely, exactly the slow, quiet dying we spent the last long stretch of the dark learning to see. The fading patronage, the thinning of the scholars, the shifting of what people cared to study, and above all the patient rot of papyrus in that soft sea damp air, every scroll needing to be copied afresh every few generations, or it would simply return to nothing, and a collection housed in a temple whose whole religion was going quietly out of the world, was, by 391, about as untended and unfunded and unrenewed a thing as could be imagined. The books on that hill, whatever remained of them, had most likely been dying for a very long time already, in the dull, ordinary way that everything in this story dies, of not being tended, so that even if a few scrolls did perish when the temple came down, they were the last thin remnant of a collection that had been ebbing away for centuries, and not the sudden fiery end of a living library. And the mother collection, the great Museion library down in the royal quarter by the palaces, that was a separate thing entirely, on a separate site, a mile from that hill, and it plays no part in this day at all. It had already suffered its own long fading, as we have seen, and whatever was left of it was not on the Acropolis to be touched by any of this. So the honest picture is this, and I want to draw it slowly so that it settles. On that hill, in that year, a real and violent and terrible thing happened. A magnificent building was gutted. A 300-year-old god was hacked apart. An ancient religion was driven from its last high refuge. and the men and women who had loved that place, who had prayed there and studied there and grown old there, watched their whole world broken open in an afternoon, and their grief was real and is worth honouring across all these centuries. That is a true loss. It is simply not the loss the myth wants it to be. It is the loss of a temple and a faith and a way of living in the world. It is not the burning of the Library of Alexandria, because the Library of Alexandria, both of its houses, had already mostly slipped away into the quiet dark long before that crowd ever climbed those steps. And I owe you now the hardest and cleanest line of the honesty contract, the one I will not flinch from, even though flinching would make a tidier story. We do not know exactly what books, if any, were still on that hill in the year the temple fell. We do not have an inventory. We do not have a catalogue of the last shelf. Nobody counted the scrolls of the Serapeum on their way to nothing, because nobody ever counts the ordinary quiet dying of anything until it is much too late, and so anyone who tells you a number for what was lost there, anyone who says 40,000 or 10,000, or 300,000 went up on that hill in 391, is not reporting a fact to you. They are performing a feeling. They are reaching past the edge of the evidence into the warm dark of guess and grievance, and dressing the guess up in the costume of a figure. And I would rather hand you the honest emptiness than the dishonest number. We know the temple fell. We know the god was broken. We do not know, and cannot know, and I will not pretend to know, how many books, if any, were still there to fall with it, and that not knowing, as we agreed hours ago about another room in another building, is not a hole in the story. It is the shape of the truth. And you are allowed to rest your weight on it, because it will hold, in a way that a comforting lie never quite does. And let me linger for a moment longer on those silent witnesses, because the more carefully you listen to the men who are nearest to that day, the more the silence turns from an absence into a kind of testimony in its own right. Think about who these writers were, and what they wanted. Rufinus, our closest source, was a Christian churchman writing for a Christian audience in a moment of Christian triumph, and to him the fall of the Serapeum was not a tragedy at all, but a victory. The pulling down of a false god, the cleansing of a proud hill, and a man telling a victory story reaches, instinctively, for everything that makes the victory look complete, and yet even he, with every motive to enlarge the scene, and no motive on earth to hide a bonfire of pagan books, gives us the god and the temple and the rats and the flames and no library, because there was, it seems, simply no library left worth the telling. And on the other side of the line stands Eunapius, the pagan, the mourner, a man whose every sentence about these years drips with grief and contempt for the Christians who unmade his world, and Eunapius would have given a great deal to be able to write, and they burned the wisdom of the ages, and they fed the philosophers' books to the fire. It would have been the perfect accusation, the perfect proof of barbarism, and he was not a man to leave such a weapon on the ground, and he too is silent about any burning of books, because you cannot mourn, even in fury, a thing that was no longer there to be lost. When the man who wants the scene bigger and the man who wants the enemy blacker both decline to mention the burning library, the honest conclusion is not that they forgot the most important thing in the room. It is that the most important thing in the room, to the imagination of a later age, was not in that room at all. And that Roman soldier historian I mentioned, Ammianus, deserves one more moment too, because his little grammatical tense, the past tense, the were and the had been, is one of the quietest and most powerful pieces of evidence in this whole night. He was not making an argument. He was not defending anyone or accusing anyone. He was simply a sober military man, describing the wonders of a famous city a handful of years before the riot. And when his pen reached the libraries of the Serapeum, it slipped, without any drama, into the tense we use for glories that are over, the way you might say of some grand old institution in your own city, that was a marvel once. And that unthinking little slip of grammar, made by a man with no reason to lie and no story to sell, tells us more truly than any dramatic scene ever could that the shelves on the hill were already, in living memory, a thing of the past. So how did this real event, a temple, a god, a riot, an edict, become, in the retelling, the fiery murder of 500,000 scrolls. The same way the harbour fire became one, the same way everything in this story swelled in the dark. Later writers, and much later writers, and the great historians of far more recent centuries reaching back across a gulf of 1,000 years and more, found on that hill everything a good dramatic ending needs: a beautiful doomed building, a broken god, a shouting crowd, a definite date, a clear villain in the shape of a zealous bishop, and the human mind, which cannot bear a slow and blurry death and craves a sharp and pointed one, quietly moved the library up the hill to die inside the scene that already had the fire and the crowd and the flames, because it is so much easier to mourn a thing that ends in a single afternoon than a thing that took 600 years to go out. The event was real. The library's death in it was borrowed, laid over the top of a genuine catastrophe long afterward, the way the flames of the burning god were borrowed to light the shelves that history's imagination wished had been standing there. And here, at the top of the taken hill, with the temple down and the god in pieces, and the church not yet risen on the rubble, is exactly where the myth reaches for its last and most famous names. And I will name them now only to say that they are still to come, so that you know the shape of the road ahead even as you drift. For after the temple there is a person, a woman, a philosopher and a mathematician, one of the last great teachers of that fading world, whose terrible death a single generation after this hill would so often be told as the very death of ancient learning itself. And after her, far off and far later, across 2.5 centuries more of quiet, there is the most cinematic accusation of them all, the one about a caliph and a conqueror, and the scrolls that were said to have heated the city's bathwater for 6 months, the tidiest and most travelled of all the tales, and, we shall find, the emptiest. Both of those we will walk into next, gently, and set right the same way we have set right the fire in the harbour and the fire on the hill, by building the strong form of the story honestly, and then reading what the witnesses actually said, and what they did not say, and letting the silences speak. But not yet. For now it is enough to stand here in the cooling evening with the truth of this one date settled softly around us, that in 391 a great and beautiful temple was thrown down, and a made god was unmade, and an old faith lost its last high house, and it was a real thing and a hard thing and a mournable thing, and that the Library of Alexandria did not die there. Because the Library of Alexandria was already, by then, mostly and quietly long gone, having slipped away not in flames on any single afternoon, but in the slow, patient manner of the last long chapter, shelf by shelf, in the dark, of not being tended. The hill is quiet now. The dust of the broken god has settled in the streets below. The pieces have burned down to nothing in the public squares, and the crowd has gone home, and the evening has come on over the harbour the way it always does, indifferent and calm. The lighthouse away to the north beginning to show its one small fire against the deepening blue. And two things are true at once, the way two things so often are. Something was lost on that hill, and it was not the thing you were always told was lost, and both of those truths can lie side by side in the dark, without troubling each other, and without troubling you. So let the temple settle, let the god rest in his pieces, let the year 391 take its true and smaller and sadder place in the long fade, one wound among many, real and grievable and not the death. And let us gather our patience and our receipts once more, and turn, unhurried, toward the last two names the myth still has to offer, knowing already, before we even reach them, what kind of thing we are likely to find waiting there in the dark. A real event, dressed up long afterward in borrowed flames. So come down off the hill now, gently, the way you would come down any hill in the dark, feeling for the ground with the front of your foot. Leave the fallen columns of the Serapeum behind you, and the broken god, and the dust settling in the torchlight, and let the years turn over quietly beneath us. One, and then another, and then 24 of them altogether, until the century has rounded its corner and we are standing in the same city, Alexandria on its harbour, under the same wheeling stars, in the year 415. The lighthouse is still burning out on its spit of rock. The ships still ride at anchor. The pale limestone quays are still there, warm all night with the day's sun. But the city has changed its temper. It is tenser than it was, quicker to the knife, split along a dozen seams at once. The old prefect and the new bishop pulling against each other for the soul of the place. Crowds that gather too fast and disperse too slow. A hardness in the streets that everyone can feel and nobody can name, and into the middle of this, into the very eye of it, the myth places its most beloved and most misunderstood death. The one that 100 later tellings have tried to make into the true and final burning of the Library of Alexandria, though not one scroll is harmed in it, and no library so much as appears. I mean the death of the woman philosopher. You have almost certainly met her, or met the shape of her, because she is the figure the story reaches for when it wants to make the loss of the ancient world personal, and wearable and grievable in a single human face. Let me build you the version you have likely been handed, honestly and warmly, the way we have built every myth tonight before we ever laid a finger on it, because it is a beautiful and a terrible telling, and it deserves to be set down with care before it is set right. In that telling, she is the last of the great scholars of Alexandria, the last keeper of the lamp. She is the librarian of the dying library, or its guardian or its living soul. She stands at the top of the marble steps of the Museion with the last of the scrolls behind her, the sum of 1,000 years of Greek thought at her back. And when the mob comes up the steps for her, they are not only killing a woman, so the story goes, they are killing reason itself, murdering the mind of the classical world, and when she falls the library falls with her, and the long night of the Dark Ages comes down over the empty shelves like a lid over a lamp. It is cinema of the highest order. It has been painted and filmed and set to music. It has been made the exact hinge on which the whole history of learning is said to swing, the single frame where the light goes out. And I will not mock a word of it, because the grief in it is real grief pointed at a real crime, and the woman at the centre of it was real and brilliant, and did not deserve a fraction of what was done to her. But I promised you at the very start of this night, and I will keep renewing that promise, quietly, every time it comes due, because a promise is only worth the times you keep it when it costs you a good story. I promised you that where the record and the myth disagree, we would follow the record, and say plainly what it says, and plainly what it does not, and never dress a guess in the robes of a fact. So let me tell you who she actually was, because the truth of her is not smaller than the legend, it is only quieter, and more particular, and, I think, more worth the loving. Her name has come down to us, and I will give it to you softly, the way you would say the name of someone you did not want to wake. Hypatia. She was a Greek woman of Alexandria, born there, raised there, and by the time of the year we are standing in she was somewhere near her 60s, no longer young, a known and honoured figure in the city, which matters because the legend likes to make her young and the record does not. Her father was a mathematician and astronomer named Theon, and here is the first true thing that the myth blurs. Her father, Theon, is the last member of the old Museion, the founding institution of this whole story, whose name we can actually attach to it in the surviving record, the last scholar we can point to and say, this one belonged to that ancient body. And she was his daughter, and his pupil, and in time his equal and more than his equal. He wrote of editing and preserving the great mathematical works with her help, and she went on past him, teaching and writing on her own account. She worked on the deep mathematics of the age, commentaries on the great treatises of arithmetic and of conic sections, the geometry of cones and curves that is far harder than it sounds, and was hard even then. She worked on astronomy, on the tables and the reckonings by which the heavens were mapped and predicted. She is credited, by those who knew the tools of her trade, with a hand in refining the instruments of her science, the astrolabe, that flat brass model of heaven you hold in the hand, and the hydrometer for the weighing of waters, but most of all, and most importantly for the setting right we are about to do. She was a teacher, the head of a school of philosophy in Alexandria, a Neoplatonist, keeper of a tradition of thought that ran back through the centuries to Plato himself, and her lecture hall drew the brightest of the city's young to sit at her feet. And here is the tender detail that the myth of the murdered library cannot use, and so it leaves it out. Her students were not all of one party. Pagan and Christian alike came to learn from her. One of them, a young man who would grow up to become a bishop of the new faith, wrote her letters that survive to this day, letters full of love and reverence, addressing her as his teacher, his mother, his sister, the true guide of his soul, asking her advice on the making of scientific instruments and on the troubles of his heart. She was, in other words, not a partisan swept up in a war of religions, but a figure above the war, respected across the lines, which is precisely and cruelly what made her so dangerous to have alive when the lines hardened and the city went looking for someone to blame. For that is what killed her, not a war on books, not a war on knowledge, not a great burning of a library, but a squalid and vicious political feud, the kind of thing that has murdered people in every city in every century, dressed for once in the robes of Alexandria. She had become close to the Roman prefect, the governor of the province, a man locked in a bitter and escalating quarrel with the powerful bishop of the city over who would truly rule the streets, and she being famous and unaligned. And a woman and a pagan philosopher friendly with the prefect became the rumour's easiest target. It was whispered that she was the witch keeping the two men from making peace, that her learning was sorcery, that if she were removed, the trouble would end. And so one day in the season of Lent a mob caught her in the street, dragged her from her carriage, hauled her into a church, and killed her there with a horror I will not lay out in detail at this hour of the night, save to say that it was slow and it was savage, and it was done by human hands to a defenceless old woman, and that afterward what remained of her was carried out and burned. That is the true crime. And I want us to grieve it. Here, together, on its own terms and for its own sake, and not let the myth cheapen it by making it stand for something it was not. Because that, in a strange way, is its own small insult to her. She was a real person. She had a body that felt the cold of that spring day, and hands that had held the astrolabe, and a mind that had gone further into the geometry of curves than almost anyone alive. And she was torn out of the world by a frightened, furious crowd for reasons that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with power, and that is a true tragedy, whole and sufficient in itself, and it does not need to be inflated into the death of civilization to be worth the tears. So let us set it right, gently, with the two plain facts the record actually gives us, and hold them beside the legend and let you judge. The first, she was not a librarian. She kept no library that we know of, she guarded no famous collection, she did not fall on the steps of the Museion defending the scrolls, because by 415 there was no great collection there for her to defend, and no Museion in its old glory for her to belong to. That world, as we spent a long quiet hour of this night establishing, had ebbed away centuries before, through defunding and neglect and the slow rot of papyrus in the damp, long before she was ever born. She was a philosopher and a mathematician who taught in a city that had once, ages earlier, housed the greatest library on earth, which is a very different thing, and the difference is the whole point. And the second fact, which follows from the first and softens the grief without ever excusing the crime, her death did not put out the light of learning, because the light did not depend on her, and it did not go out. Alexandria went on. Its schools went on. Scholars went on teaching philosophy and mathematics and medicine in that city for generations after she was gone. The commentaries were still written, the students still came, the astrolabes were still made. Her murder was the end of a life, and it may fairly be called the end of an era, the last bright, unaligned, freely teaching figure of her particular kind, in that particular place, At the moment the world was closing in, but it was not the burning of a collection. Because there was no collection left to burn, and the mob that killed her, God forgive them, did not lay a hand on a single scroll. They came for a woman, out of politics and fear. The library was already a memory when they came. So let that death lie where it truly lies, as a human murder, mourned as a human murder, one brilliant woman lost to the oldest and stupidest violence there is, and let us carry her out of the crossfire of the myth, where she has been made to stand in for a thing she was not, and set her down at last under her own name, for her own sake. And now, having buried her honestly, we come to the last of them. The last accusation, the last name the myth reaches for, and the most cinematic of them all, so cinematic, so perfectly shaped, that it has outrun every correction ever offered against it, and gallops on to this day through 1,000 retellings, and I would love you to feel its pull before we take it gently apart. Because half of understanding a good legend is admiring how well it was built. Turn the years over once more, past Hypatia, past the last of the old teachers, down through the long slow twilight of Roman and then Byzantine Alexandria, more than 2 centuries of it, until we come to the year 642, when the armies of the new faith out of Arabia, the armies of Islam in the first astonishing generation of its conquests, came to Egypt and took Alexandria for the Caliph. And here the story blooms, and it goes like this. In the conquered city, so the tale runs, there was still a great library, the last of the fabled scrolls of Alexandria, the surviving books of the ancient world, gathered under one roof, and a learned man of the city, a philosopher, came to the conquering general and begged him for the books, that they might be spared. And the general, an honourable man, would not decide it himself. He wrote to the Caliph, far away in Arabia, and asked what should be done with this great library of the Greeks. And the Caliph, so the story goes, sent back an answer so terrible and so tidy that it has been quoted for 800 years. If these books agree with the Book of God, he is said to have written, then they are superfluous, and we do not need them, and if they disagree with the Book of God, then they are pernicious, and we do not want them, therefore. In either case, destroy them. And so the tale finishes with a flourish that no screenwriter could improve. The scrolls of Alexandria were carried out and distributed among the bathhouses of the city. The public baths, of which the story says there were 4,000, to be burned in the furnaces that heated the water, and there were so many books, and they burned so slowly, that they fed the fires of the baths of Alexandria for 6 full months. 6 months of the wisdom of the ancients turned to warm water for the bathers of a conquered city. Feel the shape of that. Feel how good it is, how complete, how quotable, how it hands you a villain and a martyr and an unforgettable image all at once, the philosophy of Plato and the geometry of Euclid going up the flue to heat somebody's bath. It is one of the most repeated stories in the whole history of the idea of lost knowledge, and I have to tell you, with all the honesty this night is built on, that it is almost certainly not true, and the beautiful thing, the restful thing, is that we do not have to guess at that or take it on faith, because the reasons are plain and orderly, and you can hold them one at a time. Here is the first, and by itself it is nearly enough. The story does not appear anywhere, not in any surviving source, Christian or Muslim, Greek or Arabic, for something like 600 years after the conquest it claims to describe. 600 years. Sit with the size of that silence the way we have sat with big numbers all night. The conquest happens in the 600s. The tale of the Caliph and the baths first surfaces in writers of the 1200s and 1300s, medieval authors, writing more than half a millennium after the event, at a distance in time greater than the distance between us tonight and the very first ships of Columbus. In all the centuries between, the conquest of Alexandria was written about and written about again by people much closer to it, including Christian writers of Egypt who had every reason in the world, and every willingness, to record any atrocity the conquerors committed against their books and their faith, and who set down the fall of the city in some detail, and not one of them mentions a great library, or a fateful order, or the burning of the scrolls, or the 6 months of heated baths. The single most quotable act of cultural destruction in the ancient world, and the people living nearest to it, in the generations right after, say nothing at all. That is not how the memory of a real catastrophe behaves. A real burning of the last library of Alexandria would have left a wound in the record you could feel your way along in the dark. This one leaves no mark for 6 centuries, and then arrives, all at once, fully formed and perfectly phrased. And that brings us to the second reason, which is the shape of the thing itself. Listen again to the caliph's supposed answer. If they agree with the Book of God, they are superfluous. If they disagree, they are pernicious. So either way, burn them. That is not the shape of a report. That is the shape of a fable. It is too neat. It is too balanced. It turns on a tidy little either or that closes like a trap. The way the punchlines of moral tales close, and not the way real decisions, made by real harried administrators in a newly conquered city with 1,000 practical things to worry about, ever actually sound. It has the polish of something that has been told and retold and shaped in the telling until every rough edge is worn smooth and only the point remains, which is exactly what a fable is, a story sanded down to its lesson. And it is, tellingly, a story that was told before, about other conquerors and other books, a wandering shape that attaches itself to whichever destroyer a later age wishes to paint a certain colour. It is a piece of portable literature, a costume that fits many actors, and here it has simply been dressed on the conqueror of Alexandria long after he was safely dead and could not answer for it. And there is a third thing, quieter than the other two, but in some ways the most damning, and it is the one that gives me, oddly, the most peace. Because it does not require us to judge anyone's character at all, it only requires us to remember what we already know. Everything we have walked through together on the long, slow road of this night tells us the same thing. By the year 642, there was no great library of Alexandria left standing to burn. There had not been for centuries. The lavish collection of the Ptolemies had ebbed away in the slow, quiet manner we followed hour by hour, the lost patronage, the scattered scholars, the papyrus crumbling in the sea damp faster than tired hands could copy it. Whatever fire the harbour saw in Caesar's war was a wound and not a death, and the city read on for ages after. The daughter collection on the Temple Hill, if anything of it still remained by 391, was a shadow of a shadow when the Serapeum came down. By the time the armies of Islam rode into Alexandria, the great library was already 300 years and more into its grave, dispersed and copied and carried away and rotted and forgotten, and you cannot carry to the furnaces a thing that is no longer there to be carried. The most cinematic destruction in the story runs aground on the plainest fact in the story. There was nothing left to destroy, and so the tale of the caliph and the baths joins the others, not as history but as legend, a story invented long afterward, for reasons of its own age's quarrels, and hung like a borrowed cloak on the shoulders of the last conqueror to hold the city. Precisely because a great civilization needs its great losses to have a face and a moment, and a villain. And the slow truth that the thing simply faded, untended, over 6 unhurried centuries, is far too quiet a death for the size of the grief. Now stand back with me a moment, here in the last of this chapter, and look at the 3 of them together, laid side by side in the dark, because this is the small clear thing I have been walking you toward all along. 3 great destructions, 3 famous dates the myth loves to point at and cry, there that is the night the Library of Alexandria burned. 391, the throwing down of the Serapeum on its hill. 415, the murder of the woman philosopher in the street. 642, the conqueror and the scrolls in the furnaces of the baths. And look what happens to each of them when you walk up close with a lamp and the honesty to see. The first is a real event. A temple truly fell. A beautiful building and a whole way of worship were truly lost. But the near contemporary witnesses describe the fall of the idol and say nothing of the burning of a library. because there was no great library still on that hill to burn. The second is a real event. A woman was truly and horribly murdered, but she was a philosopher and not a librarian, killed by politics and not by any war on books, and the collection she has imagined defending was already generations gone. And the third is not, so far as we can tell, a real event at all. A fable with no source for 600 years. Hung on a conquest that arrived to find the shelves already empty. 3 dates, 3 fires the myth insists on, and not one of them, looked at closely, is the burning of the Library of Alexandria, because each is a real thing, or a made-up thing, dressed up long after the fact in flames it borrowed from somewhere else. That is the pattern, and once you have seen it you cannot unsee it. The myth does not invent its fires out of nothing, it borrows them, from a temple that truly fell and a woman who truly died, and a conquest that truly came. And it drapes them, one after another, over a library that was not there to catch. And if not one of these famous fires is the real death, if the villains the story loves are each, on inspection, innocent of the particular crime laid at their feet, then the question we set out with at the very beginning of the night is still standing, patient and unanswered, in the middle of the room. If the Library of Alexandria did not burn on any of these nights, and did not die by any of these hands, then how, truly, did the greatest library the world had ever known actually vanish? We have cleared away the borrowed flames, we have sent the false villains home. And now at last, with our hands full of receipts, and the whole long night behind us, we are finally ready to give the real answer, the slow one, the sad one, the strangely consoling one, and to lay it down softly, and let it carry you the rest of the way towards sleep. And so here we are, you and I, at the far end of the night and the far end of the story, with the whole long journey behind us now, and nothing left ahead but rest. And I think you can feel, the way you feel the tide turn, without ever seeing it move, that we have arrived somewhere quieter than where we began. We started this evening standing inside a picture, the picture you already carried before I ever said a word, the one everybody carries, of a single terrible night, a single great fire, the flames climbing the shelves in the dark, 500,000 scrolls going up at once, the whole memory of the ancient world curling into ash and smoke in the space of a few hours by one careless torch or one wicked hand. And I promised you, right there at the beginning, that we would build that picture honestly, and then take it apart honestly, and that wherever the evidence ran thin, or the old writers fell to arguing among themselves, or nobody truly knew, we would stop and say so plainly, and not pretend to a certainty we had not earned. We have kept that promise all the way down, through 600 years and 500 receipts, and now, with our hands full at last, we are allowed to do the thing we could not do at the start. For the simple reason that we had not yet earned it, we are allowed to answer the question. How did the greatest library the world had ever known actually vanish? And the answer, now that we can say it whole, is the gentlest and the least cinematic answer imaginable, and I want to lay it down slowly, one piece at a time, the way you lay a child's clothes over a chair at the end of a long day, because there is no hurry left in any of it, and the truth deserves to be handled softly. It did not vanish in a night. It was never killed by one villain. There was no single fire that we can point to and say, there, that was the end. That was the hour the light went out. Because the light did not go out in an hour. It went down the way a lamp goes down when no one remembers to trim the wick and pour in the oil. Not blown out, not snuffed, not dramatic in the least, but slowly starved. Over so long a stretch of quiet years that no one who lived through any single one of them would ever have said, "This is the year the library died." Gather it up with me then, the whole slow shape of it, so that you can hold it, once, entire, before you let it go. There was a little fire, yes, Caesar's fire in the harbour, in the year 48 before our era, and something by the water burned that night, some warehouses, some scrolls waiting at the docks perhaps, but the writers who tell us of it are late and few, and cannot agree with one another whether it was 40,000 or 400,000. And the plainest fact of all stands against the legend like a wall. The city went on being a great home of learning for centuries afterward, its scholars still working, still teaching, still measuring the heavens, which is not a thing a burned-out library can do. So the fire was a wound, and not the death. And after the wound came the long, quiet, unglamorous middle that the myth always skips, precisely because there is no fire in it to point a finger at. The centuries when the kings who had once poured out their treasure to buy every book on earth grew distracted and poorer and stopped. When a jealous ruler drove the scholars out of the city and scattered them across the sea. When the great institution stood on, but smaller, its funding thinning, its privileges worn away, its lamps fewer down the colonnade each generation. And underneath all of that, patient and tireless and utterly without malice, worked the truest enemy of all, not a torch and not a mob, but time itself. And damp. And the simple mortal frailty of papyrus, which is only reeds and river water, and will not last, which must be copied out again by a living hand every few generations, or it will yellow and freckle, and grow brittle and crumble quietly too, powder on the shelf where it sits. That is the thing the myth can never tell you, because it is not exciting, and it is the thing that is truest. A great library is not a building of stone. It is a living act, an act of constant, patient, unending copying, one reed pen at a time, one scroll at a time, forever. And the moment that copying slows, the moment the young scribes are not hired and the new rolls are not made, the collection begins to die of its own accord, silently, shelf by shelf, in the dark, with no flame to mark the passing, and no one to write down the date. And then, when the great thing had already mostly ebbed away in that quiet manner, came the famous names the myth loves to reach for, the ones it dresses up, long after the fact, in borrowed fire. The Serapeum thrown down in the year 391, a real temple, a real and violent day, a beautiful building and a whole way of life truly lost. But the writers who stood near enough to tell us of it describe the toppled god and the broken columns, and do not describe a great library of books burning on that hill, because whatever had once been housed there was by then long diminished, and the heart of the collection had been a separate and already fading thing for generations. The woman philosopher killed in the year 415. A real and brilliant teacher, murdered in a vicious feud. A death worth mourning for exactly what it was, and grieving on its own terms. But she kept no library, and guarded no scrolls, and the great institution was already gone before she was ever born, so that her death marks the end of an age, the closing of a long twilight, and not the burning of a collection that no longer stood to burn. And the Caliph's soldiers in the year 642, feeding the scrolls to the bath furnaces of the city for 6 long months. The most cinematic tale of all, and the emptiest, a story that appears in no source whatsoever for some 600 years after the day it claims to describe, that surfaces only in the pens of much later writers, that has the neat and tidy shape of a moral fable rather than the ragged shape of a true report, and that shatters against the same plain wall as all the rest, by the year 600. In 42 there was no great library of Alexandria left standing for anyone to burn. So there it is, the whole of it, gathered into one hand at last, not a night but 6 centuries, not one fire but a little fire, and a great deal of dark. Not a villain, but a slow procession of ordinary neglect, lost patronage, scattered scholars, shrinking budgets, changing fashions in what men thought worth the keeping, and always, underneath, the patient rot of reeds in the sea-damp air. The Library of Alexandria died the way nearly everything great actually dies, and I want you to hear this gently, because it is the true shape of the answer, and it is a kinder shape than the fire ever was. It died the way a garden dies when it is not weeded, the way a friendship dies when no one writes, the way a language dies when the children stop being taught it, slowly, quietly, mostly unwitnessed, of simply not being tended. And that is a sadder truth than the single fire in one way, because you cannot be angry at it, there is no torch to curse and no tyrant to blame. There is only the long human failure to keep doing the small, dull, faithful thing, the copying, the funding, the trimming of the wick, year upon year upon year. But it is also, and here is where this story turns warm, the way this story was always going to turn warm, because it is the middle of the night and I would not leave you in the cold. It is also a truth with a door in it. A truth that opens, if you follow it far enough, onto something like consolation. Because if the library did not die in a night, then neither did the knowledge die at all. Sit with that for a moment, at this hour, because it is the most consoling receipt in the whole of the evening, and I have been saving it for the end, the way you save the last warm thing for last. The myth of the single fire is a story of total loss, everything gone, all at once, in a few hours, nothing left but ash. And it is a story that makes people grieve as if a whole wing of the human mind were amputated in one night and can never be got back. But the slow death tells a very different tale, and it is true, and it is this. Knowledge that dies slowly has time to escape. A collection that fades across 600 years is a collection whose scrolls, over all those centuries, are being copied and carried and quietly walked out the door the entire time, into other cities, into other hands, onto other shelves that would outlast the ones in Alexandria by 1,000 years. Every scholar who was driven out of the city in that ancient purge did not carry an empty head. He carried what he knew, and where he settled he taught it, and his students copied it, and it lived. The great works that had been edited and catalogued and made perfect on the banks of the harbour, the Homer, the geometry, the astronomy, the medicine, the mapping of the stars, did not sit in one pile waiting for one flame. They had already been recopied and sold and sent abroad 100 times over, to Pergamon and to Rome and to Athens and to Antioch, so that the burning of any one copy on any one night in any one city was never anything more than the loss of a single leaf from a tree that was quietly seeding itself across the whole of the known world. And when the ancient world itself grew old, and the western half of it went dark, the seeds had already blown east and south and into the quiet places, and they took root exactly where you would least expect the memory of a pagan library to be kept safe. It went into Byzantium, into the great city on the straits, where scribes in cold stone rooms went on copying the Greek that Alexandria had loved, keeping Homer and Euclid and Ptolemy alive by hand, letter by letter, for 1,000 years more. It went into the vast and generous learning of the Islamic world, into Baghdad and its house of wisdom, into Cairo and Cordoba, into the hands of scholars who did not merely copy the old Greek books, but hunted them down, and paid gold for them, and translated them into Arabic, and then argued with them and improved on them, so that the mathematics and the medicine and the astronomy of Alexandria were not only kept but carried forward, added to, made greater, in the very centuries the Western world had half forgotten they existed. And it went into the small, cold, patient copying rooms of distant monasteries, where men who had never seen the sea and never heard the name of the great harbour bent over their desks in the northern dark and copied out, without always even understanding it, the wisdom that had been born under a Mediterranean sun. And centuries later, when the world was ready to remember, all of it came flooding back. The Greek out of Byzantium, the Arabic translations back into Latin, the monastery copies down off their shelves, and the men who thought they were rediscovering a lost world were really only opening books that faithful hands had never once stopped copying. And I owe you, one last time, the honesty I promised you at the very start of the night, so let me pay it here before we go any further into the warm. We do not know, and we will never know, exactly how much was lost along that slow 600-year descent, how many plays we never got to read, how many histories, how many songs, how many quiet observations of the moving stars that no hand happened to copy in time before the reed went to powder. That grief is real, and I will not pretend it away, because there were surely thousands of works that slipped through every net and are simply, wholly, gone, and no library on earth will ever give them back. But grief for what was lost is a very different thing from the myth of the total fire. And the difference is the whole of the consolation. The myth says everything burned in a night, and the truth says most of it walked away over years, and between those two stories there is all the room in the world for comfort. For the works that mattered most, the ones that were read and loved and taught and argued over, were exactly the works that got copied the most, and so were exactly the works most likely to survive, and the sea of ancient writing did not evaporate in an hour, but drained away slowly, over centuries, leaving behind on its shores precisely the things that hands had reached for, often enough to save. Do you see what that means, lying there in the dark? It means the fire was a lie in the kindest possible way. It means that far, far more of the ancient mind survived than the myth of the single flame will ever let us feel. That when you read the geometry of the earth measured from a shadow in a well, when you look up a star by the name the old astronomers gave it, when you hold in your hands almost any thought that reached us from that golden age on the harbour, you are holding something that did not perish in Alexandria, because it had already been copied and carried far beyond the reach of any fire, long before the fire the myth wants you to weep forever came. The building went down slowly, and the tending failed, and the great rooms emptied, and the lamps went out one by one, but the thing the rooms had been built to hold slipped away over the water in 1,000 small boats, in 1,000 copied scrolls, in 1,000 student memories, and lived. Nothing was saved by heroics. Everything that was saved the same dull, faithful way it had been made, by ordinary people doing the small, unglamorous thing, copying a page, buying a book, teaching a class, carrying a scroll from a dying city to a living one, over and over, for 1,000 years, most of them never knowing they were saving anything at all. And there, I think, is the one small line I would have you carry over the edge of sleep tonight, the thing the whole long evening folds down into if you let it, small enough to hold in a hand already going loose on the pillow. Nothing truly great ever vanishes in a single night. It is either tended or neglected, slowly, over a very long time, by perfectly ordinary people. And what is loved enough to be copied never really dies. Not the library. Not the knowledge. Not, in the end, anything that anyone cared for enough to write down twice. The great things are not lost in fires. They are lost in the slow failure to keep them, and they are saved in the slow patience of keeping them, and both of those are made not of drama, but of small daily faithfulness. Which means, and let this be the last warm thought before I let you go, that keeping the light is never the work of heroes and torches and one great night. It is the work of quiet hands, ordinary hands, hands like yours, doing the small dull loving thing again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. So let it go now, all of it, the fire that was not, the villains who were not, the 600 quiet years, the scrolls carried away over the water into safety. You have carried the whole of it long enough, and you do not have to carry it any further, because it is finished, and it is understood, and it is safe now in the keeping of all the patient copying hands who have already kept it far better and far longer than either of us ever could. There is nothing left for you to hold. Let the story slip off the way a scroll slips closed when you loosen your fingers, softly of its own weight, back into its own quiet shape. And let the body come down after it, the way it always does at the end of these hours together, one piece at a time, unhurried, nothing forced. Let the small muscles around the eyes go first. They have been working all day and all evening, and they are allowed now to stop. Let the brow smooth, and the jaw come unclenched, and the tongue rest soft behind the teeth. Let the shoulders go down that last little distance they have been holding in reserve, down away from the ears, heavy and warm and done. Let the arms grow loose, and the hands fall open the way the fingers fall open when the last thought lets go of the last worry, and let the long muscles of the back and the legs sink and spread and give their whole weight over to the bed beneath you, which is holding you completely, which asks nothing of you, which will keep holding you all night long. And let the breath find its own slow water, the way the copied books found the current and rowed it away to safety, in without effort, and out a little longer than the in, each one going down a step softer than the last, carrying you gently downstream, loaded like a good boat on a good river with everything you need and nothing you do not. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing to keep. The keeping is being done for you tonight, by other hands, in other rooms, the way it always has been. And so come and stand with me one last time, softly, the way we always end, at the edge of the water in a city that has been asleep for 2,000 years. It is deep night on the harbour of Alexandria. The great crowds and the great arguments and the great burning that never quite happened the way they told it, all of that is gone down under the dark, and the water lies flat and still, a wide, calm sheet of deep teal going to black, barely breathing against the pale limestone of the quays. The wooden ships ride at their anchors with their single masts bare and their sails furled for the night, rocking so slightly you would have to watch a long while to be sure they moved at all, and the low sprawling city rises gently behind, honey and bone and pale stone, its lamps mostly out now, its people mostly sleeping, the way you are nearly sleeping, the whole warm weight of it settling into the dark. And out at the mouth of the harbour, on its long spit of rock, the great lighthouse still stands, the Pharos, the tallest thing on all that coast. 3 tiers of pale weathered limestone climbing broad to narrow to slender against a sky gone deep and endless blue, and at its very summit. Small and steady and utterly unbothered by any of the 600 years we have walked tonight, the fire is still burning. One patient fire, in its brazier at the top of the world, throwing its long warm ribbon of gold out across the black water, turning slowly to sweep the dark, keeping the watch over the sleeping ships and the sleeping city and the whole quiet harbour, the way it has kept it night after night after night, faithfully, without complaint, without drama, without ever once needing to be a story, just a fire tended, kept alight by ordinary hands through the long dark. Because that is the whole of the task and always was. That is all the light in Alexandria ever needed. In the end, not to be saved from a single great fire, but to be tended, patiently, one night at a time. And it is being tended. The stars are wheeling slowly over the lighthouse the way they wheeled over the astronomers who first mapped them here, the same slow silver wheel, in no hurry at all, and the fire is burning, and the water is still, and the scrolls are safe far away, in 1,000 copying hands that will never stop, and there is nothing left in all the world that you are needed for tonight. So let the lighthouse keep its watch. It is very, very good at it. It has been doing it for longer than you can imagine, and it will go on long after you have drifted down past the last of my voice into the warm dark where the dreams are, and it does not need your help, and it does not need your worry, and it asks only that you rest. Let go of the last of it now. Let the harbour hold you the way the water holds the ships. Let the fire at the top of the tower keep the light so that you do not have to. And if you are already mostly gone, already somewhere out past the quays and the anchored ships, drifting on the slow dark current between hearing and dreaming, then good, that is the whole of the idea, and that is the story doing its quiet work, and there is nothing more for you to do but slip the rest of the way under. Sleep now. The harbour is still there, and the water is calm, and the stars are still turning over Alexandria, and the great lighthouse is still burning its one patient fire out across the dark, keeping the watch over the sleeping ships and the sleeping city, and just for tonight, over you as well. Good night.